Compilation of the best videos of 2025. Did you know Confederate General Robert E. Lee actually has his own holiday? You see, Virginia Governor Fitzhugh Lee, a former Confederate officer and nephew of Robert E. Lee, created the holiday in 1889, being observed on Lee's birthday, January 19th. However, in order to honor and celebrate Lee's right-hand man, General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, the day was changed to Lee Jackson Day in 1904. Many other states also adopted the holiday, including Tennessee, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, and Florida. In 1983, however, the holiday was again changed, being merged with the newly created federal holiday Martin Luther King Jr. Day, creating Lee Jackson King Day in 1985, though that only lasted until 2000 when Virginia Governor Jim Gilmore felt that the holidays needed to be separated. Unfortunately for Robert E. Lee, his home state of Virginia eliminated the holiday in 2020, while Arkansas and Georgia simply changed the holiday. Although Virginia, the creator of the holiday, abolished it, some states like Mississippi and Alabama split the day with Martin Luther, while Texas renamed it to Confederate Heroes Day. 201 years ago, on January 21st, 1824, Thomas Stonewall Jackson was born. Like many other Civil War generals, Jackson graduated from West Point Military Academy and served in the Mexican-American War. Since he was a loyal Virginian, Jackson quickly joined the Confederacy when the Civil War began, and during the first major battle of the war, the Battle of Bull Run, Jackson earned his famous nickname of Stonewall Jackson, as his brigade put up a valiant defense against multiple Union attacks. From that point on, Jackson became legendary throughout the South, becoming well known for his disciplined troops known as the Stonewall Brigade, which became one of the most effective fighting forces in the war. During his Shenandoah Valley campaign, Jackson, with a small force of around 15,000 troops, used speed, deception, and aggressive tactics to outmaneuver, attack, and confuse the 60,000-strong Union force, ultimately preventing the Union from taking the Confederate capital, Richmond. When he became General Lee's right-hand man, the duo formed a legendary partnership that fought together in the battles of Second Manassas, Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. Unfortunately for Lee and the Confederacy, Jackson was mistakenly shot and killed by his own men while scouting enemy positions. Did you know that during the Battle of Stamford Bridge, a lone Viking warrior reportedly held off the entire English army? You see, after English King Edward the Confessor died, King of Norway Harald Hardrada sought to claim the English throne, so he led a fleet of 300 ships and 10,000 men to invade England. However, Harold Godwinson was crowned and rapidly assembled his 15,000-man army to meet him. In just 4 days, Godwin's men traveled a staggering 185 miles, catching the Viking force completely off guard as the English army swiftly assaulted the enemy forces. As the remaining Vikings attempted to retreat across Stamford Bridge to the rest of their forces, a single giant Norse warrior, possibly a berserker, single-handedly delayed the English force from crossing the bridge. Since the bridge was so narrow, only a few Englishmen could attack him at once, allowing the Viking to slash through about 40 English soldiers by himself with just his Dane axe. Despite being vastly outnumbered, he managed to hold his ground for an astonishing amount of time, creating chaos among the English ranks. Eventually, however, he was defeated when an English soldier floated onto the bridge and thrust his spear up the Norseman. What was Napoleon Bonaparte's last victory? Well, it was actually just 2 days before his final battle and defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. You see, when Napoleon returned from his exile, the 7th Coalition of the United Kingdom, Russia, Austria, and Prussia declared Napoleon an outlaw, and each fielded about 150,000 men to end his rule. Napoleon knew that if the coalition armies combined, he would have no chance of winning, so he planned to destroy the closest armies of Prussia and Britain first before they could be reinforced. Napoleon divided his army into 3 parts, 2 wings to attack and a reserve force to quickly react and support either wing. In the afternoon, the French launched their main attack against the Prussian center at the village of Ligny. The Prussians put up a fierce resistance as both sides suffered heavy casualties in close combat. However, the French, using concentrated artillery fire and coordinated infantry assaults, gradually gained ground. Meanwhile, to the west, Napoleon had sent Marshal Ney to engage the Anglo-Allied forces under the Duke of Wellington in order to prevent them from reinforcing Prussian Field Marshal Blücher. As the battle raged into the evening, Napoleon deployed his elite Imperial Guard in a decisive assault against the exhausted Prussian center, shattering Prussian lines and forcing them to retreat. Why did the US drop the atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? You might think that the best option was to drop the bombs on the highly populated capital city of Tokyo, but Tokyo had actually already been devastated by bombs throughout the war, and the US wanted to show that the atomic bomb could delete a city in seconds. On top of that, they needed Emperor Hirohito alive to surrender, since American command believed that preserving the Emperor's position would make Japan more likely to accept defeat. So instead, the Manhattan Project's Target Committee issued the recommendations of Kokura, Yokohama, Hiroshima, and Kyoto based on their qualifications of a large urban area of more than 3 miles in diameter, capable of being damaged effectively by the blast, and likely to be unattacked by August 1946. Additionally, the US wanted targets with a high military presence and war production to force Japan to surrender. So the final targets were Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki. Since Hiroshima's weather report for August 6 was good, it was bombed. The next bomb was scheduled for August 11th on Kokura. However, bad weather not only pushed the bombing to August 9th, but it also forced the target to change to Nagasaki. 81 years ago, on January 27th, 1944, the siege of Leningrad ended. You see, the capture of Leningrad was one of the main goals of the Germans during Operation Barbarossa, as it was not only politically and symbolically important, but it also had military importance with over 600 factories and the main Soviet Baltic Fleet. When Army Group North under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb advanced to Leningrad, the city's civilians frantically constructed trenches and anti-tank fortifications, which actually halted the Germans in the suburbs of Leningrad. With his army now bottled up in trench warfare, the Führer ordered them to settle in for a siege. Constant artillery and Luftwaffe bombardment killed many, but the biggest cause of death was the critically low food supply, which led to an estimated starvation death toll of around 1 million. The only supply route to the outside world was Lake Ladoga, which was used to carry in food and supplies, though the city continued to stay critically undersupplied. After suffering 1.5 million casualties under an almost 900-day siege, the Red Army, with 1.25 million men, overran the German lines, causing them to retreat from the city. 162 years ago, on January 29th, 1863, the Bear River Massacre occurred. As the United States continued their westward expansion, hostilities with white settlers over land and resources continued to increase among many Native American tribes. Particularly the Shoshone, led by Chief Bear Hunter, had been struggling to survive due to starvation, disease, and skirmishes with American settlers in the region. Since the Shoshone had raided multiple settlers, Utah territorial officials called on Colonel Patrick Conner's California Volunteer Army to punish the tribe. Colonel Conner and his roughly 200 soldiers, looking for a fight, eagerly left Fort Douglas in Utah Territory for the Shoshone village near Bear River. After sneakily making it to the Shoshone winter encampment of about 500 people, Colonel Conner ordered a direct frontal offensive against the natives at 6 a.m. However, the defensive preparations of the natives allowed them to inflict some casualties, forcing the Americans to retreat and regroup, though Colonel Conner quickly changed tactics by sending a few small groups to flank, attacking the village from the sides and behind, resulting in most of the village being massacred. Did you know the longest battle of World War I was the Battle of Verdun? You see, German Chief of General Staff Erich von Falkenhayn believed that the key to winning the war was by defeating the French in a major battle of attrition, by wearing down their soldiers, resources, and morale. To achieve his aim of bleeding France white, Falkenhayn targeted the fortress city of Verdun, not only for its strategic value, but also because of its symbolic importance, as he hoped the French would defend it at all costs. At 4 a.m. on February 21st, 1915, over 1,200 artillery pieces bombarded the city, which was followed by German infantry, which initially made great gains. However, French General Philippe Pétain began to mount a fierce and determined defense with the famous rallying cry, "They shall not pass." With both sides simply trying to exhaust the other's manpower and resources, the battle swiftly became another example of World War I's useless slaughter, as neither side really cared about territorial gain. Mutual determination to bleed the other side led to hundreds of thousands of men and resources being put into the battle for 303 days. But after 700,000 total casualties, Paul von Hindenburg stopped the attacks. How Daniel Morgan won the Battle of Cowpens. You see, American General Daniel Morgan knew two things. He was facing off against experienced and disciplined British forces under Colonel Banastre Tarleton, and he knew that his own men, mostly made up of militia, were poorly trained and had a reputation of running in the heat of the battle. So in order to win, Morgan arranged his troops into 3 lines. The first line was made up of sharpshooters who would fire a few shots, then retreat. The second line, made up of militia, would deliver a volley and then withdraw. Then the final line was made up of better trained and well-disciplined Continental Army regulars, who would stand firm and engage in close combat. The Americans' layered lines lured lured the British into a false sense of victory as the British pursued the retreating militia. This left the British disorganized as they reached the experienced Continental soldiers who stood their ground and launched a devastating counterattack, while at the same time American cavalry assaulted the British from the flanks. Surrounded and overwhelmed, Tarleton's forces eventually crumbled, resulting in their defeat with over 800 casualties. 82 years ago, on February 2nd, 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad ended. Since the Germans failed to capture the Soviet capital of Moscow, they decided in the summer of 1942 to target the southern Soviet Union, specifically the industrial city of Stalingrad, to destroy the city's industrial capacity, to block supplies from reaching the rest of the Soviet Union, and to gain access to the oil fields nearby. The Germans' artillery and Luftwaffe bombardments decimated much of the city, but since Soviet soldiers kept coming so close to the German army, the Germans could not bombard a city without also suffering casualties. So the fighting quickly became a grueling battle of urban warfare, with both sides engaging in close quarters combat in the city's ruins. Stalin ordered the defenders at Stalingrad to take not one step back, and also refused to evacuate any civilians, which obviously resulted in massive civilian casualties. Eventually, in November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that encircled 300,000 Germans inside Stalingrad, leaving them no choice but to surrender, ending the battle with about 3 million total casualties. Did you know that the Romans would actually fill the Colosseum with water to enact naval battles? Staged naval battles known as Nomakia first occurred in 46 BCE, when Julius Caesar created a fake lake around 1,800 feet long and 1,200 feet wide to hold a battle of 12 ships and 6,000 men. For decades, other Roman emperors would create lakes or flood amphitheaters to hold naval battles, which often consisted of criminals, war prisoners, slaves, and even real soldiers or sailors, although it is unknown how staged or real the fighting actually was. The grandest Nomakia was held in 52 AD in honor of Emperor Claudius. Located on Fucine Lake, it represented a battle between Sicily and Rhodes, featuring over 100 boats and a massive 19,000 combatants, all of whom were convicts. Shortly after the Colosseum was completed, Emperor Titus flooded it using 3,000 men to replicate the battle between Athens and Syracuse. Though, since a complex network of tunnels and chambers beneath the arena was built, the Colosseum was likely never flooded again. How Harold Godwinson defeated the Vikings at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. You see, after English King Edward the Confessor died, King of Norway Harold Hardrada and Duke William of Normandy sought to take the throne from the new king, Harold Godwinson. When Hardrada landed first in the north with a fleet of 300 ships and 10,000 men, he defeated a local English force. So when Godwinson marched his 15,000-man army 185 miles in just 4 days, the Norwegians were caught completely off guard, as they not only didn't expect Godwinson to arrive, but they also expected hostages to be handed over to them. So they were unprepared and without armor. The English swiftly assaulted their forces guarding Stamford Bridge. However, as the English attempted to cross the bridge to attack the unarmed and unprepared Vikings, a single giant Norse warrior single-handedly delayed the English force from crossing the bridge. Although he held off the English for a bit, he ultimately did little, as many of Hardrada's forces were still disorganized and without armor. Despite Hardrada's efforts to rally his men in a shield wall, the heavily armored and disciplined English housecarls cut through the Viking ranks, breaking the shield wall and slaying Hardrada. Why did Robert E. Lee join the Confederacy? You see, after serving 36 years in the US Army, Lee had earned a reputation as one of the finest American officers. So, President Lincoln actually offered Lee command of the United States Army being raised to put down the rebellion. But Lee's family legacy was deeply tied to Virginia, so he declined, stating, "I look upon secession as anarchy. If I owned the 4 million slaves in the South, I would sacrifice them all to the Union. But how can I draw my sword upon Virginia, my native state?" Although Lee was personally conflicted about secession and slavery, he felt that his primary duty and loyalty was to his state rather than to the federal government, which was a pretty common belief, as about 286 of the 1,080 active US Army officers joined the Confederacy. So, after Virginia officially seceded, Lee resigned from the Army, stating, "Save in defense of my native state, I never desire again to draw my sword." Though Lee didn't immediately seek out to join the Confederate military, when Virginia's leaders called upon him to serve, he felt compelled to answer, so he was given command of the Army of Northern Virginia in 18 1762. 262 years ago, on February 10th, 1763, the 7 Years' War ended. As French and British territories expanded in North America, disputes over land claims rapidly increased. Eventually, a small skirmish between British and French troops escalated into a massive worldwide conflict between the alliance of Great Britain, Prussia, and Portugal against France, Austria, Russia, and Spain. Initially, Britain failed to achieve any victories in North America against the French and their native allies. However, under the leadership of William Pitt, Britain shifted its focus to defeating France globally by deploying its vast navy. The turning point came in 1759, known as the Year of Victories, as the British Navy dominated the seas, securing many key victories all over the globe, while Prussian King Frederick the Great managed to turn the fighting around in Europe. Although hostilities ended between a few countries by 1763, the war officially ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, leaving Britain not only in control of Canada, but all of France's North American territories east of the Mississippi River, along with most of their territory in India, Africa, and the Mediterranean. How the Mongols brutally sacked Baghdad. While the Abbasid Caliphate was in decline, the Mongols, under the rule of Genghis Khan and his descendants, had already conquered vast territories across Asia and were seeking to expand their empire further into the Middle East. To ensure the submission of the Abbasid Caliphate, Möngke Khan sent Hulagu with about 150,000 men to the Abbasid capital, Baghdad. Although Caliph al-Mustassim refused to surrender, he was so overconfident that he didn't gather armies or strengthen the walls. So, after defeating a 20,000-strong Muslim cavalry outside the walls, the Mongols surrounded the city with a moat and a wall to cut off its supplies, allowing them to unleash their siege engines against Baghdad's defenses. The 50,000 unprepared and untrained Muslims were no match for the 150,000 strong, experienced Mongol force. So in just a few days, the Mongols had managed to capture much of the wall. Seeing his city fall, the Caliph surrendered on February 10th, 1258. But that was not the end of the city's suffering. As the Mongols wanted to show the consequences of defying the Mongol Empire, they sacked the city mercilessly, slaughtering an estimated 200,000 to 1 million people while looting and destroying mosques, palaces, libraries, and hospitals. 216 years ago, on February 12, 1809, Abraham Lincoln was born. Since he was born into a poor frontier family, Lincoln had little formal education, though through hard work and determination, he educated himself, allowing him to work many jobs, including as a store clerk, a rail splitter, a surveyor, a militia captain, and a skilled and honest lawyer, earning him the nickname Honest Abe. However, as the issue of slavery expansion increased, the anti-slavery Lincoln entered politics, helping form the Republican Party and fighting to end the expansion of slavery. Although he only served one term in Congress, Lincoln's inspiring speeches against slavery won him the presidency in 1860. But despite promises that he would not take steps to outlaw slavery in existing states, anxious southern states seceded from the Union anyway. After southern troops fired on Fort Sumter, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. However, the Union unfortunately suffered many defeats early in the war, but Lincoln never gave up, issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the southern slaves. Although Lincoln led the nation to victory during the Civil War, his term in life were tragically cut short by John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated him on April 14, 1865. The bloody history of St. Valentine's Day. While it is unclear exactly which martyr named Valentine the holiday originated from, since there were multiple Valentines in Rome who were executed around the same time, the most well-known was priest Valentine of Rome, who, according to legend, defied Emperor Claudius II's ban on all marriages. Since he performed marriages for young lovers in secret, he was imprisoned, and while he was in prison, he allegedly befriended the jailer's daughter. So when he was taken off to be executed, he left a farewell note for her and signed it, "From your Valentine." However, there was also Saint Valentine of Terni, a bishop who was beheaded, and a third Valentine was a martyr in Rome's African territory. No matter who exactly Valentine was, early Christians, in order to convert more people, would often combine pagan holidays with Christian ones, which resulted in Pope Gelasius I officially establishing February 14th as St. Valentine's feast day in 496. as he intended it to take the place of the Roman festival of love, Lupercalia, which was celebrated in February. How just 150 British troops defeated over 4,000 Zulu warriors. You see, after a 20,000 strong Zulu force attacked and annihilated 1,700 British troops at the Battle of Islandwanda, the victorious Zulu, eager to continue their attack, advanced towards Rorke's Drift, where a small British force was located. Although the 150 British defenders led by Lieutenants John Chard and Gonville Bromhead were massively outnumbered, they prepared to make their stand. To win, the British knew they needed to keep the Zulu far away, as it would not only prevent them from using their primitive spears and shields in close quarters combat, but it would also allow the British to use their long-range Martini Henry rifles. With their barricades of bags, crates, and wagons set, the British looked upon the hundreds of Zulu warriors charging straight towards them in a frontal assault. The extremely disciplined and well-trained British gunned down hundreds of their enemy, but as the battle raged into the night, the Zulu broke in, resulting in brutal combat. Though the determined British held their ground, using their superior firepower and disciplined formation to repel each assault. As dawn broke, the exhausted British defenders saw that the Zulu had retreated, having suffered over 1,000 casualties to the British 32. 96 years ago, on February 14th, 1929, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre occurred. You see, since the US had outlawed alcohol, organized crime, especially the American Mafia, boomed. Bootlegging, the illegal manufacture and sale of alcohol, as well as speakeasies, underground drinking establishments, earned tens of millions of dollars. So it is not a surprise that two rival factions sought control of the big city of Chicago. Al Scarface Capone's Italian Chicago outfit fought with George Bugs Moran's Irish North Siders. Although violence between the gangs had been going on for years, when a $50,000 bounty was placed on Al Capone's head, he reached a breaking point and ordered that Moran's gang be destroyed. Since the Chicago outfit knew that Moran's men would be getting a shipment of alcohol at their garage at 10:30 a.m., 4 of Capone's men entered the building, while 7 members of Moran's gang were waiting for the shipment. Since some were disguised in police uniforms, they lined the North Siders up against the wall, making them believe it was simply a routine police raid. However, while facing the wall, 70 rounds of ammunition were fired without warning, killing all 7 of the men. Although Capone and his gang were the main suspects, no one was officially charged. Did you know that the Union burned the city of Columbia during the Civil War? As General William T. Sherman led his forces through the South, his strategy was to break the Confederacy's ability to continue the war by targeting their infrastructure, supplies, and morale. Since South Carolina was the birthplace of secession and the start of the war at Fort Sumter, their capital city of Columbia was a prime target, as it was not only an important city to capture for its symbolic value, but also because of its stockpiles of weapons, ammunition, and cotton. So after the city surrendered, Sherman's forces entered the city, freeing Union prisoners and slaves. Chaos quickly erupted throughout the city with widespread looting and burning, though it is unclear whether the burnings were completely intentional, as many eyewitness accounts say some Union soldiers set fire to the city. However, General Sherman claimed that the raging fires were started by the evacuating Confederates, writing, "Though I never ordered it and never wished it, I've never shed any tears over the event, because I believe that it has hastened what we all fought for, the end of the war." While Union General Henry Slocum stated, "A drunken soldier with a musket in one hand and a match in the other is not a pleasant visitor to have about the house on a dark windy night." 108 years ago, on December 30th, 1916, Rasputin was killed. After having a major religious conversion during his youth, Rasputin became a wandering monk, known for his mystic abilities, including the ability to heal people. He eventually was allowed to enter the court of Tsar Nicholas II, where he quickly became a trusted advisor since he was apparently able to stop the bleeding of their hemophiliac son, Alexei. However, not everyone accepted the random, scandalous Siberian peasant monk into the royal court. Many Russian nobles, journalists, clergy, political leaders, and even peasants were displeased with the amount of influence he had over the Tsar's family. When World War I broke out, Tsar Nicholas had left Petersburg, effectively leaving the country in the hands of Rasputin. This finally pushed a group of nobles to invite Rasputin to a party with pastries and wine laced with cyanide meant to poison him. However, remarkably, Rasputin seemed unaffected, so instead they simply shot him multiple times. Yet again, their attempt failed, as Rasputin attempted to escape. Finally, the assassins caught up to Rasputin, beat him, shot him some more, but again he appeared alive, so they simply resorted to dumping him in an icy river. Why Banastre Tarleton became the most hated British officer of the Revolutionary War. As commander of the British Legion, an elite force of loyalist cavalry and infantry, Tarleton became famous for his brutal, no-mercy approach to warfare. His forces often burned farms, looted homes, and terrorized civilians, which only fueled the rebellion rather than crushing it. But it was at Buford's massacre that cemented his legacy as Bloody Banner. Man and ban the Butcher. On May 29, 1780 at Waxhaws, Tarleton's seasoned dragoons charged into the American line led by Colonel Abraham Buford. Many American troops tried to surrender, but Tarleton's men showed no mercy, slaughtering 113 Americans while wounding 203, though many were left to die of their wounds. After the battle, the phrase Tarleton's Quarter became a rallying cry for American patriots, meaning no mercy would be given or expected in battle. Although it is debated exactly how ruthless Tarleton was, stories of his brutality quickly spread across the colonies, leading to a huge increase in volunteers to the Patriot Militia. 58 years ago, on June 5th, 1967, the Six-Day War began. Although Israel had defeated the surrounding Arab nations 19 years earlier, conflicts between the countries never truly ended. Tensions with Egypt, Syria, and Jordan had been rising for years, but when Egyptian President Nasser expelled UN peacekeepers, blockaded Israeli ships, and mobilized his troops, full-out war was looming. Israel, surrounded and outnumbered, struck first. In a surprise air assault, they destroyed over 300 Egyptian aircraft in mere hours. Now, with total air superiority, they launched tanks and infantry into Sinai and Gaza, completely overwhelming and pushing Egyptian forces out. Meanwhile, Jordan and Syria launched attacks from the east and north, but Israel's superior coordination and intelligence flipped the odds. With rapid airstrikes and swift tank attacks, they were able to capture East Jerusalem and the West Bank from Jordan, while also storming the Syrian-held Golan Heights. In just 6 days, Israel had defeated 3 major Arab nations and taken control of a vast amount of new territory. 250 years ago, on June 14th, 1775, the US Army was founded. Just 2 months after the battles of Lexington and Concord, it became clear that the local, part-time civilian militias were not enough to take on the most professional army in the world. So the Continental Congress created the Continental Army, stating 6 companies of expert riflemen be immediately raised in Pennsylvania, 2 in Maryland, and 2 in Virginia, and that each company, as soon as completed, shall march and join the army near Boston, under the command of the chief officer in that army. The various militias were now unified into a central organization under the command of Commander-in-Chief George Washington. Instead of simple militias, the American Patriots were now a standing army, with better training standards, stronger leadership, and greater coordination. These Continental Regulars formed the core of Washington's fight against the formidable British Army. And with help from European officers like Prussian General von Steuben, the army was molded into a proper fighting force. 81 years ago, on June 6, 1944, the Allies launched their D-Day invasion into Normandy. After years of preparation, the Allies were finally ready to launch their massive invasion into occupied France. However, they would first have to get through Germany's concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, anti-tank obstacles, mines, and artillery batteries. So to land their troops, the Allies launched their invasion in 3 phases. First, 24,000 paratroopers would land behind enemy lines, disrupting the Germans' ability to coordinate reinforcements by destroying their bridges and cutting communication lines. Secondly, the Allies unleashed a massive aerial and naval bombardment to soften German defenses along the coast. Finally, the Allies launched their amphibious landing assault on the Utah, Omaha, Juneau, Sword, and Gold beaches. Here, American and British troops encountered fierce resistance by heavily fortified German positions, where machine guns and artillery rained down on the men storming the beaches. But despite these brutal obstacles, the Allies managed to secure all 5 beachheads by the end of the day, successfully landing more than 160,000 troops and 6,000 vehicles. Why was Omaha Beach so bloody? You see, although the Navy and Air Force bombarded the defenses along the coast, they failed to inflict much damage. This was especially bad for the 1st and 29th Infantry storming Omaha Beach, since that area was fortified with concrete bunkers, barbed wire, anti-tank obstacles, and extensive minefields. But what made the beach landing especially hard and unique were the steep 30-meter high rocky cliffs, which not only made it difficult for the soldiers to get up and take out the German defenses, but the cliffs overlooking the wide open sands made a great spot for German machine guns and artillery to decimate incoming American landings. Even worse, initial waves of troops often landed without the necessary tanks and specialized equipment. Despite the overwhelming odds and heavy losses, the Americans eventually managed to secure a foothold by sheer determination and courage. Small groups of soldiers began to penetrate the German defenses, scaling the cliffs and taking out enemy positions in fierce close-quarters combat. By the end of the day, the Americans had established a hold on Omaha Beach, at the cost of approximately 2,400 casualties. 57 years ago, on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. In Memphis, Tennessee, King was in town to support striking sanitation workers. However, that evening, as he was leaving his room at the Lorraine Motel, a single shot rang out. Dr. King was hit with a bullet in the jaw that quickly severed his spinal cord, causing him to instantly collapse on the motel balcony. Although he was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, it was too late. He was pronounced dead at 7:05 p.m. at just 39 years old. Not far from the scene, the alleged assassination weapon, a Remington hunting rifle, was found, and along with fingerprints, belongings, and eyewitness reports, escaped convict James Earl Ray would be arrested. After pleading guilty, he was sentenced to 99 years in prison, though to this day, many still question if he acted alone. Just a few days later, on April 9th, King was buried in his hometown of Atlanta, Georgia. That day, tens of thousands took to the streets to pay tribute to King's casket. Were the atomic bombings on Hiroshima and Nagasaki necessary? By the time the atomic bombs were ready to be used, Germany and the war in Europe had already concluded, so the United States focused on the war in the Pacific against Japan. Island after island, the United States got closer to destroying Imperial Japan as they liberated the Pacific. Despite being obliterated with bombs, the Japanese refused to surrender, so the US had limited options: either invade Japan or drop their new atomic weapons. To provoke a surrender, the US opted to drop the bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing an estimated 200,000 people. However, without the bombs, a land invasion of Japan would have been extremely costly, as the Japanese civilians and military would have fought to the last man. The Japanese slogan at the time even stated, "The sooner the Americans come, the better. 100 million die proudly." Tens of millions of Japanese, as well as hundreds of thousands of Allied troops, would suffer until the Japanese government unconditionally surrendered. Some say, however, that the bombs were unethical and that the Japanese were already going to surrender. So many still debate the question, why was Japanese Admiral Togo called the Nelson of the East? You probably know Britain's legendary Admiral Horatio Nelson, who defeated Napoleon's French and Spanish fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar. But why was Admiral Togo compared to him? Well, during the Russo-Japanese War, the Russian Baltic fleet had sailed 18,000 miles to Japan. But instead of facing them head-on, Admiral Togo executed the crossing the T maneuver, similar to Admiral Nelson at Trafalgar. This classic naval tactic allowed Togo's fleet to cut across the path of the Russian ships, allowing the Japanese to unleash full broadsides while the enemy was forced to only fire forward. So, the uncoordinated and outdated Russian fleet was absolutely obliterated, with 21 of their ships sunk and over 5,000 sailors dead. Togo's victory not only won the Russo-Japanese War, but it shocked the world, as it marked the first time an Asian power had decisively defeated a European power in a major modern conflict. In 1867, Russia sold Alaska to the United States. But why? Well, in the 1850s, the Russian Empire suffered an immense defeat during the Crimean War. That defeat had greatly drained them of money and manpower. And it also made the Russians realize that in another war, they would likely lose Alaska to Britain, since it was incredibly difficult to resupply and keep control over the massive territory so far away. Ultimately, selling Alaska to the Americans would not only allow them to get cash for something they would potentially lose later on, but it also prevented Russia from pouring in even more manpower and resources into the territory. But this raises another question. Why did the US buy Alaska? Well, many Americans wanted to expand American influence across the continent and into the Pacific, not only for trade with Asia, but also as a symbol of manifest destiny. So in 1867, the United States purchased Alaska for 2 cents per acre, or $7.2 million, which is equivalent to around $162 million in 2025. In 1901, President William McKinley reached out to shake the hand of a supporter during a meet and greet. But instead of a friendly interaction, he was unexpectedly hit with 2 bullets. McKinley quickly sank to the floor while the assassin was tackled and detained. The crowd wanted the shooter dead right there, but McKinley calmly asked no one to hurt him. But who was the man that did it? Anarchist Leon Czolgosz. He was able to conceal his revolver in line by hiding it under a handkerchief. McKinley was rushed to the hospital, but unfortunately, no one was qualified to operate on him. The closest gunshot expert was already in surgery, so McKinley had to go into surgery with a man who was a gynecological surgeon. Surprisingly, however, McKinley seemed to improve after the surgery. Although they only were able to remove 1 bullet, McKinley's condition seemed to actually improve. However, just days later, it was clear that he had contracted gangrene. So, just 8 days after the incident, McKinley would pass away on September 14th, while Leon Czolgosz was sent to the electric chair just 45 days later. Israel, 1973. The country was shut down for the holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur. But just across the border, their Arab neighbors, Egypt and Syria, launched a massive coordinated surprise attack to regain territory lost 6 years earlier in the Six-Day War. With Soviet weaponry, Egypt crossed the Suez Canal into the Sinai Peninsula, while the Syrians assaulted the Golan Heights. Within hours, the Israeli military was pushed back on multiple fronts, suffering hundreds of casualties and the destruction of their tanks and aircraft. Initially, the military response from Israel was underwhelming, but after a few days, their forces were fully mobilized, and after stopping the Egyptian advances, they were ready for a counterattack. In a stunning offensive assault, Israeli forces crossed the Suez Canal and invaded Egypt. They were now threatening the Egyptian capital of Cairo. Meanwhile, in the north, Israel had been able to repulse Syria's invasion and was now threatening their capital, Damascus. However, after 3 weeks of fighting, the US, Soviets, and UN intervened to eventually broker a ceasefire. 80 years ago, on April 7th, 1945, the Japanese battleship Yamato was sunk. As the largest and most powerful battleship ever constructed, Yamato boasted 9 massive 18-inch guns, 6 6-inch guns, and heavy armor. However, by 1945, Japan had been beaten back so much that the Yamato's last mission was simply to inflict as many casualties as possible while defending the island of Okinawa. So, in a final desperate attempt, Japan sent Yamato and a small escort of 1 light cruiser and 8 destroyers on a one-way trip. Immediately, US forces spotted the battleship and mobilized over 400 aircraft to intercept. With no air cover of their own, the Japanese could do little to fend off the waves of American dive bombers and torpedo planes. So after 2 hours, Yamato was hit with around 11 torpedoes and 15 bombs, which caused her ammo magazines to explode, leaving the 72,000-ton ship to capsize and sink at 2:23 p.m., taking 3,000 of the 3,300 crew with her. 86 years ago, on September 1st, 1939, World War II began. After extreme territorial losses, economic penalties, and military restrictions by the Treaty of Versailles, Germany under the National Socialists began to rearm, looking to expand their territory and regain what was lost after World War I. Although Britain and France saw that Germany was ignoring the Treaty of Versailles by militarizing the Rhineland and annexing Austria and Czechoslovakia, they ultimately did little to stop Germany, as they hoped to prevent another war. However, a line was crossed when Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France, who had a defense pact with Poland, quickly declared war on Germany. However, neither country could stop the brutally coordinated blitzkrieg attacks. And even worse, Poland was fighting a two-front war. The Soviet Union invaded from the east, in accordance with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed with Germany weeks earlier. In just 35 days, Poland had been swallowed up by 2 major powers. Still, the war was not over. France and Britain were gearing up for a fight that would span 6 more years. Why were women and children saved first on the Titanic? While you might think saving women and children first was simply maritime law, it really wasn't. This code of conduct was popularized by another maritime disaster: the sinking of the HMS Birkenhead. During that sinking, the British soldiers were ordered by Colonel Seaton to stand in place while the women and children on board could get on the limited number of lifeboats. When those in Europe heard about the Birkenhead, many, especially in the higher classes, celebrated it as a display of chivalry, honor, and duty, encouraging the practice. However, this chivalrous code of conduct wasn't applied universally across the seas. The tradition did often vary from captain to captain, so on the Titanic, it was really Captain Edward Smith that dictated that women and children would be given priority during the sinking. Many men, like first-class passenger Benjamin Guggenheim and second officer Charles Lightoller, abided by this rule, helping women and children into the lifeboats. However, there were other officers that did allow men into the lifeboats. The result? Women had a 3 times higher survival rate, and even third-class women were saved at a higher rate than first-class men. Why exactly was the bombing of Dresden so controversial? Well, in February 1945, Germany was on the brink of collapse, and although many of their cities were destroyed, Dresden had largely been unaffected, as other cities were given priority. But fears of new German defenses and a lack of Soviet advancement in the east motivated the British and Americans to bombard the city. But why was it so controversial? while Dresden actually had been flooded with hundreds of thousands of refugees. So when Allies dropped thousands of tons of incendiary and high-explosive bombs, the city, with hundreds of thousands of civilians, was engulfed in a firestorm, destroying much of the city and killing roughly 25,000 civilians. Many viewed the bombing as extremely excessive, especially given the large civilian population that was in the city. Why the Comanche were the most fearsome Native American tribe. You see, the Comanche mastered mounted warfare on horses not only better and quicker than every other native tribe, but they were just as, if not better, than the Europeans that had arrived on them, which allowed them to brutally conquer all other native tribes in a vast area of the southern plains, which included territory in New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. As the Europeans came into their territory, the Comanche would fiercely defend it, relentlessly battling any and all threats to their land. The nomadic Comanches with their horses used fluid hit-and-run tactics to strike quickly and then disappear before their enemies could mount an effective counterattack. Additionally, their excellent archery and rifle precision made them even deadlier. Raids against Spanish, Mexican, and American settlements were brutal, as they would always kill and torture the men, along with the majority of the women and children, though many were also taken captive. Even Governor of Louisiana, James Wilkinson, stated in 1805 that the Comanche were the most powerful nation of savages on this continent. Why were over-mountain men so dangerous during the Revolutionary War? Well, before the war, these rugged men actually settled beyond the formal boundaries of the 13 colonies, living in the backcountry west of the Appalachian Mountains. Life on the frontier forged them into fiercely independent, self-reliant warriors. Although they initially weren't as involved in the war, when British Major Ferguson threatened to hang their leaders and lay waste to the land with fire and sword, they quickly joined the Patriot cause and assembled their forces. However, unlike the traditional British and Continental armies, over-mountain men fought as irregular militia, using guerrilla tactics, marksmanship, and deep knowledge of the wilderness to attack. So when Major Ferguson encountered them in the Battle of Kings Mountain, their hunting, tracking, and wilderness skills gave them a significant advantage in the southern terrain. After just an hour, the over-mountain men had snuck up, overwhelmed, and decimated their enemies, killing or wounding over 300 loyalist soldiers and taking another 700 prisoner. One loyalist recalled that they looked like devils from the infernal regions, tall, raw-boned, sinewy, with long matted hair. Why did Lewis and Clark go on their expedition? You see, in 1803, President Thomas Jefferson had just purchased the massive 828,000 square mile Louisiana territory from France. So he sought to expand American territory quickly and efficiently before European powers could establish claims of their own. But with little known about the land beyond the Mississippi River, Jefferson needed answers. He wanted detailed maps, knowledge of resources, insights into Native American tribes, and most importantly, a practical water route across the continent. To lead this mission, Jefferson chose his personal secretary, Captain Meriwether Lewis, who then selected Lieutenant William Clark as his co-leader. Together, they assembled a 45-man team and set out, heading upstream on the Missouri River. Over the next 862 days, they traveled 8,000 miles, allowing them to produce about 140 of the first accurate maps of the area. Additionally, they documented 120 animal species, 200 plant species, and countless Native American cultures. Their journey transformed America's understanding of the West, paving the way for future expansion and settlement. How helpful was Sacagawea to the Lewis and Clark expedition? Born around 1788 in a Shoshone tribe in Idaho, Sacagawea's life took a dramatic turn at age 12, when she was captured by the Hidatsa and taken to North Dakota. There, she married French-Canadian trader Toussaint Charbonneau, and at just 16 years old, joined the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1805, while carrying her infant son. Despite her young age and motherhood, Sacagawea became a valuable member of their team. She negotiated with various Native American tribes for safe passage and vital supplies, helped navigate difficult terrain, and gathered local plants for food and medicine. In fact, her mere presence helped them. As Clark stated, "A woman with a party of men is a token of peace." After their boat almost sank, Lewis stated that the Indian woman, to whom I ascribe equal fortitude and resolution with any person on board at the time of the accident, caught and preserved most of the white articles that were washed overboard. So although she didn't lead the expedition, her knowledge did assist Lewis and Clark in their over 8,000-mile long journey. How Native Americans destroyed almost half of the entire US Army in a single day. In 1791, the United States wanted to expand into the Northwest Territory, but several Great Lakes tribes formed a confederation to stop them. To crush the native resistance, General Arthur St. Clair marched out with about 2,000 men, but from day one his army fell apart. His recruits were barely trained, supplies ran out, and hundreds deserted. By the time he reached the Northwest Territory, only around 900 sick and exhausted US soldiers remained. This is when the natives decided to strike. While the US troops were camping along the Wabash River, a 1,000-strong Native American force led by Miami Chief Little Turtle and Shawnee Chief Blue Jacket ambushed the unsuspecting Americans in a ferocious wave. St. Clair's troops were immediately overwhelmed and struggled to organize a defense. The native warriors expertly used the forested terrain to their advantage, striking down hundreds of troops. With his force decimated by the relentless assault, General St. Clair eventually ordered a retreat. Yet, by the time he did, only 24 of the 920 men escaped unharmed. The Battle of Wabash saw nearly half of the entire US Army destroyed in a single day. After wiping out almost half of the entire US Army, the Native Americans celebrated their victory. But the United States was not finished. Congress immediately launched the first major congressional investigation into the executive branch, and General St. Clair was forced to resign. President Washington was furious at the defeat, writing, "We are involved in an actual war." Washington demanded a new army, one that was actually capable of conducting a successful offensive against the natives. So, the new, highly trained Legion of the United States was created, led by Major General Mad Anthony Wayne. This new force would combine cavalry, artillery, heavy infantry, and light infantry into one efficient brigade-sized force divisible into standalone sublegions. With these new troops, General Wayne marched into the Northwest Territory against the Native Confederacy. After the crushing defeat at the Battle of Wabash 3 years earlier, the US had learned their lesson. General Wayne was backed up by excellent scouts and a well-trained force. So on August 20th, 1794, the well-trained, well-prepared, flexible Legion decisively defeated the natives at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. After their decisive defeat at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the native warriors retreated north toward the British-held fort of Miami Rapids, expecting to be reinforced by British troops. But when they arrived, the British refused to back them up, since they did not want to risk another war with the United States. When American General Mad Anthony Wayne learned that the British would not intervene, he ordered the burning of the surrounding native villages and crops. With their supplies ruined and no safe place to fall back to, the Native Confederacy's resistance began to collapse. Meanwhile, the British, seeing their native allies weakened, agreed in the Jay Treaty to finally give up their forts in the Northwest Territory. With no other options left, the Native Confederacy met with the US at Greenville for negotiations. The result was the Treaty of Greenville, signed on August 3rd, 1795. Ending hostilities between the United States and the Native Confederation, in exchange for the natives giving up large amounts of territory that would eventually become the future American states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan. What were the most important Union victories during the American Civil War? Well, at number 3 is the Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17th, 1862. With over 22,000 casualties, it remains the single deadliest day in American military history. But even though it was a tactical draw, General McClellan stopped General Lee's invasion of Maryland. But the most important part was that the victory allowed Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation in a period of strength, which discouraged European intervention and turned the war into a fight against slavery. Number 2, the Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1st to 3rd, 1863. In the bloodiest battle of the war, General Meade defeated General Lee's second invasion of the North, destroying more than a third of Lee's army and crushing any hopes of another Confederate offensive. Number 1, the Siege of Vicksburg. After a brutal 47-day campaign, General Grant captured the city on July 4th, 1863, allowing the Union to take full control of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two, starving it of resources, and preventing troop movements. Why did Hannibal bark across the Alps to attack Rome? Hannibal knew he had to be aggressive and strike first, but a naval assault against Rome's dominant navy and fortified defenses would have failed. So instead, he devised a bold and shocking plan to lead his men into largely undefended territory in northern Italy by crossing the formidable Alps mountain range. Most Romans believed the Alps were an impenetrable barrier, leaving them completely unprepared for the Carthaginian invasion. Hannibal also knew the local Gallic tribes could provide reinforcements and supplies, making his campaign sustainable. So Hannibal, with about 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants, began his journey from Spain into the Alps. Extreme cold weather, treacherous cliffs, and brutal attacks from local tribes decimated about half his men, but the Carthaginians eventually made it to the other side after 2 weeks. Although the Romans were completely stunned that Hannibal had arrived, they believed his forces were weak enough to easily destroy. However, at the Battle of Ticinus River, Hannibal obliterated the Romans, foreshadowing the next decade of his ruthless campaign. Why exactly did the Germans abandon their aircraft carrier during World War II? At the start of the war, the US had about 6 carriers and Britain had about 7, giving the Allies a massive advantage over Germany 0 and Italy 0. The only Axis power to have carriers was Japan. Germany, however, had only partially built one aircraft carrier, the Graf Zeppelin, but it quickly became a disaster. Since the Germans had no experience building aircraft carriers, the one they did try to make had many problems. The catapults routinely failed, the flight deck was incredibly cramped, and its aircraft capacity was simply way too small. Additionally, politics killed the program. Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring refused to allow the Navy to create specialty aircraft for the carrier, leaving the carrier only with land-based aircraft. With huge technical and political issues, construction on their carrier was stopped after about 80% of it was built. So for the remainder of the war, Germany gave up on carriers entirely and doubled down on what actually worked for them: U-boats. Why did Benedict Arnold betray the Americans during the Revolutionary War? Despite being one of the most skilled generals in the Continental Army, leading key victories at Ticonderoga and Saratoga, Arnold was repeatedly overlooked for promotions. Even after his bravery at Saratoga, where he was seriously wounded, he was passed over in favor of less competent officers, as Arnold would often argue and frustrate other officers and those in Congress. Frustrated and unable to return to active combat due to his injury, Arnold was made military governor of Philadelphia, where he clashed even more with fellow officers and Congress. He saw many in Congress as corrupt and incompetent, and his enemies began to launch attacks on his honesty, character, and reputation. Meanwhile, Arnold was in deep debt, partly due to investing his own money into the war effort, but also because of his expensive lifestyle and poor business decisions. With financial struggles, resentment towards his peers, and growing doubts about the revolution, Arnold began secretly negotiating with the British. His ultimate betrayal came when he surrendered the key fort of West Point in exchange for a British general's commission and money. Why exactly is Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great called the Great? While you might think Cyrus earned his title of Great simply through military conquests, Cyrus actually is mostly known for his exceptional administrative skills. Still, Cyrus was a very successful and brilliant military leader, launching a series of campaigns that conquered the Lydian Empire in Asia Minor and the powerful Babylonian Empire. However, he did not just use military might to conquer land, he often used diplomacy. As emperor of the Achaemenid Empire, Cyrus was known to be a very tolerant leader, especially compared to other rulers of the time. Cyrus allowed conquered people to maintain their own customs, religions, and sometimes even their own rulers, just as long as they recognized his authority. Even though he ruled over one of the largest and most diverse empires in the ancient world, his tolerant policies gained him many loyal subjects. In particular, the exiled Jews especially revered him, since Cyrus allowed them back into their homeland and helped rebuild their temple. In fact, the Cyrus Cylinder is often considered the first bill of human rights. Why did Europeans advance so much faster than everyone else? Well, the biggest cause was simply where they lived. You see, Europe is a massive peninsula with waterways everywhere. This allowed civilizations to trade resources, but more importantly, it increased the trade of ideas and inventions. Additionally, being connected to Asia allowed Europeans to come into contact with even more inventions. The Chinese may have invented paper, printing, and gunpowder, but the Europeans adapted and perfected them better than anyone. Surprisingly, animals were a major factor, since horses, pigs, cows, chickens, and sheep were all easily domesticated animals that helped build civilizations, allowing Europeans to develop strong, long-lasting, centralized governments that could organize their resources more effectively. The competition between these European powers encouraged military and technological advancements as each sought to gain an edge over the other, which also led to capitalism and mercantilism, which helped establish global trade routes, bringing more wealth and resources to European nations. Lastly, their genetics played a role, though it is difficult to determine to what extent. How the British created the largest empire in history. With the discovery of the New World, many European powers sought to establish overseas colonies to gain resources such as tobacco, sugar, ore, spices, and land. But why was Britain specifically successful? successful. While their success was determined almost entirely by their navy, their obsession with the navy encouraged massive investments in shipbuilding, navigation, and naval strategy. So their ships were not only exceptionally built, but they were also commanded and crewed by experienced, well-disciplined men. The navy allowed Britain to easily protect its trade routes, defeat rival European powers, and transport troops and resources. With the help of the East India Company, strategic holdings such as Gibraltar, the Suez Canal, Singapore, and Hong Kong helped secure their influence across multiple continents. Additionally, the rapid growth of their economy led to the Industrial Revolution, which allowed them to produce more advanced goods and military equipment such as steamships and railways, which only enabled the British to acquire more territory. Why did Christopher Columbus call the Native Americans Indians? Although some think that Columbus called the people he encountered Indians because he thought he had landed specifically in India, that is not actually true. You see, when Columbus set sail in 1492, he was looking for a new western trade route to the East Indies, a European term that simply described the islands of Southeast Asia where spice came from. So when Columbus landed in San Salvador Island in the Bahamas, he thought he had landed in the Spice Islands of the East Indies, leading Columbus to call the indigenous inhabitants he encountered Indios, which translates to Indian in English. Other explorers from Portugal, Spain, England, and France followed, causing the incorrect term to be widespread for centuries. Since most educated Europeans knew the world was round, Columbus didn't mistake where he was because he thought the Earth was flat. Rather, he simply underestimated the actual size of the planet. Columbus believed his journey sailing westward to Asia would be much shorter than it actually was, and he did not anticipate a new continent being there. 527 years ago, on May 20th, 1498, Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama became the first European to reach India via the Atlantic Ocean. For centuries, Muslims and Venetians had dominated the Asian spice trade, which ran across the Mediterranean Sea. So, to break their monopoly, Portuguese King Manuel I sought to find an alternate route to Asia by sailing around the continent of Africa, a feat that had never been done before. Nevertheless, King Manuel enlisted explorer Vasco da Gama, whose fleet set sail from Lisbon in July 1497 with 4 ships and 170 men. After navigating around Africa and the treacherous Cape of Good Hope, they were eventually helped across the Indian Ocean by a local navigator, allowing them to finally reach the port city of Calicut. But unfortunately for da Gama, his European gifts did not impress the king, and even worse, many of the Muslim traders in India were hostile. Still, da Gama was able to secure some goods and return to Portugal a hero, where his newfound route would mark the beginning of Portugal's global empire. Native Americans were not peaceful before Europeans arrived. Some might think that Europeans simply went to the Americas and started butchering the peaceful indigenous populace, but that could not be further from the truth. In fact, Europeans were often horrified at the bloody practices of many natives. For example, the Aztecs would sacrifice an estimated 20 to 250,000 of not just men, but also women and children a year. Hernan Cortez reportedly stated that they have a most horrid and abominable custom, which truly ought to be punished, and which until now we have seen in no other part. Natives all across the continent would constantly raid each other for land, resources, slaves, and religion. These raids would often engage in warfare against civilians, scalping and torturing prisoners to death while taking the rest as captives. One Jesuit account from the 18th century stated, "The only way to attract respect and public veneration among the Illinois is to acquire a reputation as a skillful hunter, and particularly as a good warrior. It is what they call being a true man." What is considered the most powerful US battleship? Well, most argue it is the Iowa-class battleship. You see, just before World War II, the US Navy designed a new class of ship, one that was versatile enough to be both powerful and fast. So, 4 Iowa-class battleships were launched during World War II. The USS Missouri, New Jersey, Wisconsin, and of course the USS Iowa. At 860 feet long and 57,000 displaced tons, these battleships combined an unprecedented level of speed, firepower, and protection, with top speeds up to 35 knots and a main armament of 9 16-inch guns arranged in 3 triple turrets. These guns could fire 2,700 pounds of high explosive and armor-piercing shells over distances of up to 24 miles. Additionally, the ships were loaded with 20 5-inch guns and dozens of anti-aircraft weaponry. Some of these ships also served during the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and even all the way up until the 1991 Gulf War. Ultimately, the combination of speed, firepower, and long-term versatility earns the Iowa class the title of the most powerful battleship in US naval history. This US ship is the oldest warship still afloat in the world. You see, in 1798, the United States launched the frigate USS Constitution. However, designer Joshua Humphreys made the ship unique for the time, prioritizing speed, firepower, and strength. She was intended to outgun other frigates, while also being fast enough to outrun larger ships. Additionally, her hull was so exceptionally strong that during the battle with the HMS Guerriere, sailors reportedly saw cannonballs bouncing off the hull, giving her the nickname Old Ironsides. In just 20 years, the Constitution had fought in the quasi-war against the French, in the Barbary War against the pirates, and in the War of 1812 against the British. Although she had a flawless 33-0 battle record, actual iron warships began to make her obsolete by the mid-1800s. But since the ship had become a symbol of American naval heritage, she was delegated as a training vessel and eventually a museum ship. And to this day, the USS Constitution is still a commissioned vessel of the US Navy, and is still manned by active duty sailors. Was the Bismarck actually powerful? You probably know that the German battleship Bismarck was so powerful that the British had to send their entire fleet after it. But in reality, the ship was practically on par with most other battleships at the time, and in some ways it was even below par. Although the Bismarck was over 800 feet long and 118 feet wide, its main armament was simply 8 15-inch guns. Compare that to the American North Carolina's class 9 16-inch guns and the Japanese Yamato's massive armament of 9 18-inch guns, it is much smaller. Additionally, the Bismarck's deck armor was fragile to aircraft, so assaults would usually prove deadly. So compared to other warships of World War II, the Bismarck was by no means head and shoulders above the rest, and in many aspects it was simply not as good. But one of the biggest flaws is that it was built for a different time. Naval warfare was now decided by aircraft, not necessarily ship-to-ship engagements. The Bismarck falls short in this department, so the Bismarck wasn't weak. It was just built for the wrong war. This is the house of American naval hero John Paul Jones. But the famous captain never actually owned this house. You see, Jones didn't really have an official home during his life, as he mostly lived on the seas in his ships, sailing for the British, Americans, and Russians during his life. But during the American Revolutionary War, this house in Portsmouth, New Hampshire did host him twice. Jones first stayed at this house in 1777 for a few months while waiting the construction of his new ship, Ranger. After terrorizing the British homeland with the Ranger, he came back to the colonies in 1781 and stayed in this house for almost a year while overseeing the construction of another ship, the America. However, he never sailed the America during the war, mostly because the war was over by the time of its completion, but also because the ship was ultimately gifted to France. Still, while staying at this house, Jones helped construct 2 ships, recruit his crew, and plan his campaigns that helped the United States gain their independence. 84 years ago, on May 24th, 1941, the HMS Hood was sunk by the Bismarck. For over 20 years, the HMS Hood was the pride of the British Navy, being one of the largest and most powerful warships in the world. But Germany had just launched their new threatening battleship, the Bismarck, which not only rivaled the Hood, but was potentially even more powerful. So to intercept this new behemoth before it could reach the Atlantic and destroy crucial shipping convoys, the British sent the powerful HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales. At dawn, 300 miles off the coast of Iceland, the British capital ships spotted and engaged the battleship Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen. Colossal shells flew across the seas, barely missing the ships. However, just a few minutes after the battle began, disaster struck. At 6 a.m., a shell penetrated the Hood's weak deck armor, likely near one of its rear magazines, instantly causing a massive explosion that ripped the Hood in half, sending the ship and all but 3 of her crew to the bottom of the sea. 84 years ago, on May 27th, 1941, the German battleship Bismarck was sunk by the British Navy. Since the Bismarck was one of the largest and most powerful warships, the British knew they couldn't allow this behemoth to raid Allied convoys in the Atlantic. However, in their first major encounter, the British had a devastating defeat with the sinking of their HMS Hood. Though, fortunately for them, the battle had damaged the Bismarck so much that the ship needed immediate repairs. So to intercept and finally destroy the Bismarck, the British sent battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and even aircraft carriers to try and hunt it down. but it was actually their aircraft that turned the tide of the fight. Reconnaissance and torpedo planes eventually located and engaged the Bismarck, and during one of the engagements, a torpedo struck the Bismarck's rudder. The Bismarck, now sailing in circles, was a sitting duck to the incoming British Navy. Although the Germans fought to the last shell, they were no match for the HMS Rodney and HMS King George V, which sent her and 2,200 of the crew to the bottom of the ocean. How many people did Harriet Tubman actually free? Born into slavery in Maryland around 1822, Tubman escaped to Philadelphia in 1849, but she wasn't about to leave her family and friends behind, so she became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, a network of secret routes and safe houses that provided shelter and assistance to escaping slaves. For over 10 years, Tubman personally led at least 13 rescue missions back into Maryland, guiding about 70 enslaved men, women, and children to freedom in the North. She additionally provided instructions that led to another 50 to 60 escapees. But she didn't stop there. During the Civil War, Tubman joined the Union Army, first as a cook and then a nurse, but she quickly became a valuable Union spy. In 1863, she helped plan the Combahee River Raid with Colonel James Montgomery, leading Union troops deep into Confederate territory in South Carolina, during which Montgomery's troops burned down many plantations and freed approximately 750 enslaved people. How many Jews fought for Germany in World War I? While you might think Jews would boycott the German military during the war, the complete opposite is actually true. Many Jews enthusiastically volunteered, seeing the conflict as a chance to demonstrate their loyalty to the German nation and secure full acceptance in German society. Roughly 18% of Jewish citizens served, which was comparable to the national average, resulting in a total of 100,000 serving in the infantry, artillery, engineering corps, medical services, and air service, with around 12,000 being killed in action. In fact, over a third of Jewish soldiers, around 35,000, received medals for valor, including the Iron Cross. But Jews especially excelled in the new Imperial German Air Service, with flying ace Wilhelm Frankel with 20 confirmed victories and Fritz Beckhardt with 17. And yet, despite all of this, many Germans still accused them of avoiding combat. So, a Jewish census was created to try and prove that Jews were avoiding the front lines. Though after the war, researchers determined that Jews were actually on the front lines just as much as the other soldiers. How this dog became a sergeant in the US Army. In 1917, a stray dog with a short tail wandered into a military training camp at Yale. His short stature and tail led the soldiers to call him Stubby. However, one soldier, Private James Conroy, became especially close to him. So when it came to ship out for World War I, Conroy smuggled Stubby aboard his ship. But Stubby wasn't just a mascot, he became a hero. After surviving a gas attack in the trenches, he learned to detect it, so he was able to not only warn soldiers about gas, but also incoming artillery. Additionally, he saved wounded soldiers by locating them in no man's land. But Stubby's most legendary act? He caught a German spy mapping Allied trenches. Stubby attacked and bit the man until soldiers arrived. For this act, he was promoted to sergeant. Stubby fought in 17 battles, was wounded twice, and received a gold medal, a wounded stripe, and 2 Purple Hearts. And after the war, he became a national celebrity until his death in 1926. Which Revolutionary War battle did Thomas Jefferson describe as the turn of the tide of success? While you might think it was the Battle of Trenton or the Battle of Saratoga, Jefferson was describing a battle that actually occurred in the Southern Theater. You see, in 1780, the Patriot cause in the South was collapsing. They had suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Camden, and had suffered one of the worst defeats of the entire war at Charleston, leaving the Carolinas largely under British control. And, even worse, British Major Patrick Ferguson and his loyalist force were sent to the Appalachian Mountains in order to crush even more Patriots. However, Colonel William Campbell assembled a force of guerrilla fighters known as Over Mountain Men. So, even though Major Ferguson set up in a defensive position, these rugged Over Mountain Men knew the terrain so well they easily snuck up and surrounded the Loyalist force. The victory at the Battle of Kings Mountain greatly improved Patriot morale while weakening the Loyalists. Additionally, General Cornwallis was forced to delay his invasion of North Carolina. 210 years ago, on June 18th, 1815, Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. Although Napoleon was defeated in 1814 and exiled to the island of Elba, he hated his life there, so he returned to France in hopes of restoring his old empire. But Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia were all determined to stop Napoleon once and for all, so they declared war not on France, but on him personally. To defeat them, Napoleon planned to attack the Allied armies one by one, before they could launch a united attack. On June 16th, Napoleon defeated the Prussians at Ligny, sending 33,000 of his own men in pursuit of them. And on June 18th, Napoleon led his remaining 72,000 troops against Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley's 68,000-man Allied army at Waterloo. The French launched numerous attacks against the Allies, but they simply couldn't break through their strong position. Even worse, Napoleon made the grave mistake of waiting until midday to allow the ground to dry. His delay and failed assaults ultimately allowed the Prussians time to join the battle, completely surrounding and outnumbering him, forcing Napoleon back into exile. Out of Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union, who did the most in defeating the Axis powers? While a lot of people cite the fact that the Red Army destroyed roughly 80% of the German military, it is important to remember that Germany wasn't the only country part of the Axis forces. The Soviets primarily fought in one theater and one front during the war, while Great Britain and the United States both contributed large parts of their Navy, Air Force, and Army in the Western Front, Mediterranean Front, and of course, the Pacific Theater. And Great Britain was the only country to fight the entire 6 years of the war. Not only did the British and American Navy and Air Force destroy the Axis supply lines, but the US Lend-Lease program boosted Allied supplies by providing food, oil, raw materials, and thousands of planes, trucks, and tanks. So while it is true that the Soviets fought in the bloodiest front, and were the main driving force behind the destruction of the German military, Britain and the US played a bigger overall role in defeating all three of the Axis powers. Why was Joan of Arc burned at the stake? Born a peasant in a small French village, Joan, as a teenager, claimed to hear divine voices and see visions of St. Michael, St. Catherine of Alexandria, and St. Margaret of Antioch. Their message? Save France from English domination by helping Charles VII reclaim the throne of France. Following these visions, Joan convinced Charles to send her with a small army to the siege of Orleans. Miraculously, she led the French to multiple victories. However, due to her success, she became a major target. So, she was eventually captured by the Burgundians, who sold her to the English. Joan was subjected to a biased and deeply political trial. Her cross-dressing was seen as an abomination, but even worse, she rejected church authority in favor of direct inspiration from God. So after refusing to submit to the church, she was forced to confess under threat of torture. However, since she recanted her confession and started cross-dressing again, she was sentenced to be burned at the stake. What actually is a casualty of war? While you might think a casualty is simply someone who is killed in battle, these words are not interchangeable and mean very different things. You see, a casualty simply refers to someone who is no longer able to fight. This can mean a few different things. It could mean someone who was actually killed, but it could also mean that someone was too injured to continue fighting. It could mean that someone was captured by the enemy, went missing in action, or were too ill to fight. Even psychological collapse could be counted as a casualty. For example, the American Civil War Battle of Gettysburg had roughly 51,000 casualties, the highest of the war. However, of those 51,000 casualties, 33,000 were wounded, 10,000 went missing or were captured, and only 7,000 died, giving Gettysburg a 13% fatality rate. However, the Battle of Antietam had a fatality rate of 16%, despite having almost 30,000 fewer casualties. So, while all those killed are considered casualties, death is only one of the ways that a soldier can become a casualty. Who was the first admiral in the US Navy? While you might think the first admiral was appointed during the Revolutionary War, that was technically the Continental Navy. And there was no admiral rank. The highest rank was actually just a commodore, partially because the Navy was fairly small, and partially because titles like admiral sounded too much like royalty to be used in a republic's navy. Even after the US Navy was founded in 1794, commodore remained the highest rank. But what changed? Well, during the American Civil War, the Union needed a much larger navy to not only blockade the Confederates, but also to capture the various river systems that flowed through the Confederate states. To accomplish this, Congress created the rank Rear Admiral. and promoted 9 men to the position. But it was officially David G. Farragut who became the first Rear Admiral in the United States Navy in 1862. But during the war, he was actually promoted again to Vice Admiral in 1864. And finally, after the war, he was promoted again to Admiral in 1866. In 1800, Napoleon was about to lose his first major battle. Just weeks after crossing the Alps, he thought the Austrians were retreating, so he spread out his army to cut off their escape. But General Melas planned to catch Napoleon completely off guard. He assembled 30,000 Austrian troops and decided to go on the offensive by launching a massive assault against Napoleon's scattered forces. The Austrians, with more artillery and cavalry, wreaked havoc on the French in the open fields. By noon, the furthest French lines had been forced back, and Napoleon was miles away. Although Napoleon eventually rushed in to reinforce his retreating men, an Austrian victory was all but certain as Napoleon and his forces were pushed back once again. However, just in time, General Desaix's men had joined the battle. Now it was Napoleon's turn to go on the offensive. The French rushed the Austrians head-on, and even when Desaix was mortally wounded, the French continued their advance, shouting vengeance. General Kellerman's cavalry struck the Austrian flank, capturing thousands and forcing the rest to retreat, completing Napoleon's greatest comeback, the Battle of Marengo. Did you know the first time a British army surrendered was during the American Revolutionary War? You see, in 1777, British General John Burgoyne moved south with 7,500 men as part of a 3-pronged attack on New York. However, 8,500 American soldiers led by General Horatio Gates had entrenched themselves at Freeman's Farm. So General Burgoyne sent his army to probe the American defenses. General Gates eventually sent out his own force to the field of the farm. There, Colonel Daniel Morgan fought in fierce combat with the British. After 5 hours, the British maintained control of the field, but after losing almost 600 troops, General Burgoyne chose to dig in, expecting to be reinforced by General Henry Clinton. However, unfortunately for the British, no reinforcements came, so they became trapped in the wilderness with limited rations. Even worse for them, the Americans had been reinforced to over 13,000 strong. In a desperate move, General Burgoyne launched an unsuccessful attack on the Americans at Bemis Heights. But with no means of escape, Burgoyne surrendered on October 17th, the first time in history a general had officially surrendered an entire British army. How the Great Heathen Army almost conquered all of England. Unlike earlier Viking raids, the Great Heathen Army, led by Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba, was a large organized force that aimed to seize and settle land permanently. So in 865, hundreds of ships with thousands of Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes invaded and established a foothold in the kingdom of East Anglia. From there, the Vikings launched their assault on the kingdom of Northumbria, rapidly advancing and seizing the strategic city of York, which became their base of operations. All hope seemed lost, but the kingdom of Wessex wouldn't fall so easily. Led by King Aethelred and Alfred the Great, the Anglo-Saxons finally put up a fight, gaining a significant victory at the Battle of Ashdown. Things really turned around when Alfred became king, as his establishment of fortified towns and a standing army made it very difficult for the Vikings to gain new territories and hold on to their existing ones, leading to a lasting peace between the people. In 1781, George Washington made a plan to defeat General Cornwallis at Yorktown. But Washington was actually in a very poor situation. His army was out of money. They lacked food, clothing, and weapons. Even worse, his troops had not been paid yet, so there were even rumors of mutiny. Washington looked to one man to help save the situation. He famously demanded, "Send for Haym Solomon." But why did Washington want Haym? Well, he had been involved with the Sons of Liberty since the start of the war, and was even arrested for spying. But Haym's biggest contribution was his financial expertise. Since he was fluent in 5 languages, including French, Haym was the perfect choice to serve as the primary broker to Robert Morris, the superintendent of finance. He not only coordinated loans with the French and the Spanish, but he was also in charge of paying the French forces that fought for the Americans. So, when Washington needed quick cash, he called for Haym, who ultimately was able to get $20,000, saving Washington's army and the Yorktown campaign. In the early 1900s, Hungary produced a group of scientists so brilliant they were called the Martians. But what exactly did they work on? Well, during the 1930s, many of these scientists had to flee Europe for the US due to a rise in Jewish persecution. Leo Szilard was the first to come up with the idea of a nuclear chain reaction, and he also co-wrote the famous letter to President Roosevelt urging America to build the atomic bomb. Eugene Wigner helped design nuclear reactors that converted uranium into weapon-grade plutonium. Edward Teller worked on the Manhattan Project and later developed the more powerful hydrogen bomb, while John von Neumann not only advised the nuclear program, he pioneered game theory and military strategy using atomic weapons. But how exactly did they get the nickname the Martians? Well, when Szilard was asked why intelligent life had not been discovered yet, he was said to have answered, "They are already here among us. They just call themselves Hungarians." Thus, the nickname of the Martians stuck. Did you know the atomic bombings were not the deadliest bombings of World War II? While you might think that the atomic death tolls at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which numbered 70,000 and 40,000, were the worst of the war, they weren't even close. It was actually the firebombing of Tokyo that killed the most people in a single day. But how? While a single incendiary bomb is nowhere near the power of a nuclear bomb, the conditions of Tokyo and US tactics caused widespread destruction. You see, the city of Tokyo was mostly built out of wood and paper, materials that ignited quickly and burned hot. So, to obliterate their capital, Air Force General Curtis LeMay ordered 300 B-29 bombers to load up with napalm and drop 1,600 tons of bombs over the city. In mere minutes, Tokyo was engulfed in a fury of 1,000 fires, with hurricane-like winds spreading flames miles across the city. Firefighters tried to put them out, but it was no use. The US had destroyed 16 square miles of Tokyo and 80,000 to 130,000 civilians in a single 3-hour air raid. In 1914, German troops were only 30 miles from Paris. Germany was about to win the war in just a few weeks. However, military governor of Paris, Joseph Gallieni, prepared to rally the French, stating, "I have received the mandate to defend Paris against the invader. This mandate I shall carry out to the end." Although the German armies were at the gates of Paris, they got there so quickly that their supply lines were overextended. So French General Joffre sent in troops as fast as possible using any means necessary, including using Paris taxicabs. Suddenly, the Germans could advance no more. French, British, and German troops clashed along the Marne River, across a 160-mile-long front. As the battle raged on, the Germans made a critical mistake. A gap had opened up between their armies. So, with this opportunity, the Entente forces flooded into the gap, eventually forcing the German armies to fully retreat, marking their first major failure of the war. However, as both sides tried to outflank the other, they began constructing a vast network of trenches, ultimately locking both sides into a brutal 4-year-long stalemate that cost them millions of lives. After conquering Gaza and Tyre, Alexander the Great was marching to Jerusalem, furious that they had refused to send him men and supplies. But instead of finding a Jewish rebellion, he met with High Priest Jadis, who was dressed in full ceremonial robes. Instead of sacking the city, Alexander reportedly bowed down to the high priest. When asked why by his generals, Alexander remarked that he had seen Jadis in his dreams right before his stunning victories. Alexander the Great was so impressed that instead of destroying their temple or forcing Greek religion, he granted the Jews autonomy and allowed them to continue their customs. Alexander even wanted a golden statue of him to be erected, but since that was forbidden, the Jews decided to honor him in a different way, by naming their sons Alexander. But the tradition of naming their sons Alexander did not stop. For over 1,000 years, Jews have continued to call their sons Alexander. Notable Jews named Alexander include Alexander Jannaeus, king of Judea, Moses Alexander, American businessman and 11th governor of Idaho, and historian and librarian Alexander Marx. How this cat survived 3 shipwrecks. In 1941, a black and white cat was aboard the powerful German battleship Bismarck. However, the British Navy quickly took out the ship with aircraft and ship bombardments, causing it to sink. Of the 2,200-man crew, only 118 survived, but among them was a cat, found floating on debris. The British HMS Cossack quickly picked him up and nicknamed him Oscar. However, just a few months later, his new home was torpedoed by a German U-boat. More than 150 men were lost, but Oscar, he survived. By now, people had started to notice. So he was renamed Unsinkable Sam by the British press and transferred to the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. Unfortunately, once again, in November 1941, Sam's ship was torpedoed and sunk. Sam again survived, being found clinging to a piece of plank. angry but quite unharmed. But after surviving 3 major naval disasters, it was decided that Unsinkable Sam had been traumatized enough, so he was retired from the sea. Did you know Erwin Rommel's wife made Germany lose World War II? You see, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was put in charge of Germany's coastal defenses along occupied France. So, in order to prevent the Allies from landing, he constructed miles of concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, anti-tank obstacles, mines, and artillery batteries. For over a year, Rommel had built the Atlantic Wall. However, since the weather reports for June were abysmal, many thought an invasion would be highly unlikely. So, many other German officers left to spend time with their families. Rommel joined them since his wife, Lucy, had her birthday on, you guessed it, June 6. So, as Rommel was giving his wife a birthday present, thousands of Allied troops were storming the beaches of Normandy. Rommel had missed the invasion he prepared so hard to stop, in part because his wife had her birthday on a specific day. Though, even if Rommel was present and prevented the landings, Germany still would have lost the war eventually. So, his wife's birthday probably only prevented more Allied casualties. How exactly did Erwin Rommel die? While you might think Rommel was simply killed in an Allied air attack, that was only German propaganda. You see, Rommel had actually been involved with some of the conspirators of the July 20th assassination plot on the Fuhrer, and even though there was no hard evidence against him, Rommel was given a choice: to take his own life quietly or watch his family suffer during a public trial. To save his family, Rommel took a cyanide pill and was buried with full military honors. Did you know Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson didn't actually die from getting shot by his own men? While you probably know that Thomas Stonewall Jackson was shot during the 1863 Battle of Chancellorsville while being mistaken for Union cavalry in the dark and dense Virginia wilderness during a scout mission, he actually didn't die immediately. Even though he was hit several times, wounding his right hand and shattering his left arm, Dr. Hunter McGuire was able to successfully amputate his left arm, so he was expected to make a full recovery. However, unfortunately for General Jackson and the Confederacy, he had pain in his side, which would turn out to be pneumonia, a very common disease for soldiers during the war, with a fatality rate around 24%. So, about a week after he was shot, he, like tens of thousands during the American Civil War, would die of disease, not battle. General Robert E. Lee was devastated by the news of Jackson's death, stating, "I have lost my right arm, and I'm bleeding at the heart." How many Americans have died in war? Well, it all started 250 years ago in 1775 during the 8-year-long Revolutionary War, which saw the death of around 25,000 Americans. Various smaller wars added around 1,800 killed until the War of 1812, and during that war around 15,000 lost their lives. 7 more smaller wars added roughly 1,600 more fatalities. Then we get to the Mexican-American War, seeing 13,000 Americans dead. 6 more smaller wars add an additional 450, and then the worst of them all, the American Civil War, which saw 620,000 killed, by far the deadliest in our history. 15 more wars with 2,100 killed later, and we get to the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War, with 7,700 dead. 5 more wars and 700 more deaths, and we get to World War I, with 116,000 fatalities. 750 more fatalities in smaller conflicts, and then we get to World War II, with 405,000 dead. The numerous wars over the Cold War period, including Vietnam and Korea, added roughly 100,000 deaths. And finally, modern wars like Iraq and Afghanistan added 7,000. So, over a 250-year period, roughly 1.3 million Americans have died for this country. Why the Battle of the Coral Sea is considered the first modern naval battle. For centuries, war at sea meant massive battleships blasting each other from point-blank range. So you might think this battle was just a continuation of that, but with larger guns. But that isn't exactly true. No battleships were deployed. In fact, the ships had no contact whatsoever. You see, ever since aircraft were introduced into war, new tactics and strategies mostly revolved around air superiority. But it wasn't until the establishment of aircraft carriers that planes would play a much larger role in determining the outcome of naval battles. So, since the Battle of the Coral Sea was fought between aircraft and their carriers exclusively, it became known as the first modern naval battle, as it introduced a new era of naval warfare where air superiority, intelligence, and coordination became became more important than battleship firepower. For 4 days, both fleets launched attack after attack, using reconnaissance and attack aircraft to locate and strike enemy carriers. And although the US suffered the devastating loss of their carrier USS Lexington, they also sank Japan's light carrier. 570 years ago, on May 22nd, 1455, the War of the Roses began. You see, after the death of Edward III, the throne was supposed to go to Edward the Black Prince. But since he had died before his father, the throne went to his son, King Richard II, not his brothers John of Lancaster or Edmund of York. However, the son of John of Lancaster, Henry IV, eventually deposed Richard II, and for the next 60 years, the throne was in the hands of the Lancasters. However, due to poor rulership, many were upset, especially since they had just lost the 100 Years' War to France. So, grandson of Edmund of York, Richard of York challenged Lancaster King Henry VI's authority, leading an army of 3,000 that met Henry's forces at St. Albans. After just an hour, Richard had won, but soon an all-out war broke out between the White Rose Yorkist family line and the Red Rose Lancaster family line, lasting over 30 years and causing tens of thousands of casualties. Did you know the Battle of the Atlantic was the longest battle of World War II? You see, immediately after war broke out, Britain and Germany began naval operations to control the vital shipping lanes between North America and Europe. Britain heavily relied on the transportation of troops, food, weapons, and raw materials from the Americas. So, to starve them of resources, German Admiral Karl Dönitz began ordering their German Navy to cripple Allied convoys. Although some warships were used, Germany primarily used U-boats, deadly submarines that operated in wolf packs to overwhelm convoy defenses. Early in the war, these U-boats were devastating, but by 1943, the Allies turned it around, cracking the Germans' Enigma code, making long-range aircraft, and creating better sonar. So, the US, British, and Canadian navies were eventually able to transport supplies and troops to keep Britain alive, which also allowed them to support campaigns in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Still, after almost 6 years, thousands of Allied ships had been sunk, and 70,000 Allied soldiers had lost their lives. The history of Israel in 60 seconds. After fleeing from Egypt, the Israelites were able to conquer many of the tribes found in the land of Canaan, eventually uniting under kings like Saul, David, and Solomon. However, over time, the unified kingdom was split between Judah in the south and Israel in the north. Unfortunately for the Israelites, the great empires of Assyria and Babylon eventually conquered both kingdoms, exiling many Jews across the Middle East. And although they would return under Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great, they would eventually be reconquered again by the Romans, who destroyed once and for all Jerusalem, the Second Temple, and most of the Jews in the area, while scattering many more across the world. However, Jews never fully left the area and survived during the reign of the Byzantine Empire, the Arab Caliphate, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the Ottoman Empire. Eventually, after centuries of persecution, many Jews began to join the Zionist movement, which called for the reconquest of their ancient homeland by Jews worldwide. So after over 1,000 years of exile, the State of Israel was finally re-established in 1948. How was Rome founded? Well, according to legend, the city was founded by twin brothers Romulus and Remus, who were said to be the demigod sons of the god Mars and Rhea Silvia, who was the daughter of King Numitor of Alba Longa. However, since Numitor's brother Amulius took over Alba Longa, he ordered Rhea to drown them in the Tiber River, so that no one could reclaim the throne from him. But their brothers survived, famously being rescued by a she-wolf, then raised by a shepherd named Faustulus. Years later, after learning of their true identity, they attacked Alba Longa, killed Amulius, and restored their grandfather to the throne. However, while trying to establish their own settlement, fighting soon broke out between them, and Remus was ultimately slain by his brother Romulus, who then became ruler of the settlement which was named after him in 753 BC. However, historical analysis around Romulus's settlement at Palatine Hill shows small communities that likely formed along the Tiber River over time, eventually growing Rome into a powerful city-state and then later an empire. Who was the highest-ranking American officer killed in World War I? Although Brigadier General Lyman Kennon died during World War I, he died of disease, not enemy fire, and he wasn't even in Europe. Though there were a few senior officers that were killed by enemy fire in Europe. The first was Colonel Reynold Bolling, Assistant Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Service, who died on March 26, 1918, during the opening days of the German Spring Offensive. Another was Colonel Hamilton A. Smith, who was killed by enemy machine gun fire on July 22, 1918, during the Second Battle of the Marne. However, there was one man with an even higher rank. In 1918, Edward Sigerfoos was put in command of the 56th Infantry Brigade and nominated for promotion to Brigadier General. However, after being in command for only an hour, he was wounded by enemy artillery, eventually dying of his wounds on October 7, 1918. And Congress, unaware that he had died, approved Sigerfoos' promotion to Brigadier General on October 10th. Who were the highest-ranking generals to die in battle during the Revolutionary War? Well, on the Patriot side, 3 major generals died in battle. The first was Joseph Warren, who was commissioned as a major general in the Continental Army on June 14, 1775. Just 3 days later, he was killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Though, during the battle, he technically volunteered to join at the rank of private. The next major general to be killed was Richard Montgomery, who was commissioned as a major general on December 9, 1775. But he didn't even know that he had been promoted when he died on December 31, 1775 at the Battle of Quebec. The final major general to perish was Johann de Kalb, who was commissioned as a major general on September 15, 1777. During the Battle of Camden, he was wounded 11 times, so he ultimately died 3 days later. But what about British generals that were killed? Well, during the Battle of Saratoga, Brigadier General Simon Fraser was gunned down by Daniel Morgan's men, while Brigadier General James Agnew was sniped at the Battle of Germantown. 162 years ago, on April 30th, 1863, the Battle of Chancellorsville began. After 4 previous attempts to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, the Union once again looked to seize it, this time with General Hooker, who outnumbered General Lee 2-1. But rather than confronting General Lee head-on at Fredericksburg, Hooker planned a flanking maneuver, using some of his men to hold Lee's attention at Fredericksburg, while the rest crossed the Rappahannock River upstream to assault Lee's left flank. Lee quickly learned of the 70,000 soldiers threatening his left flank, more men than his entire 60,000-man army, so he decided to gamble. He splits his troops up, leaving 10,000 to hold the front at Fredericksburg, while the rest of his forces gathered around in the thick wilderness around Chancellorsville, where Hooker had actually gone on a defensive. Once more, Lee split his army, sending Thomas Stonewall Jackson to attack the Union's right flank, while Lee's forces faked frontal assaults. His plan works. Jackson's surprise attack caused panic and confusion among the Union troops, shattering their lines and forcing a retreat. Who is the father of the nuclear navy? Well, in 1922, Hyman Rickover graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy and served on multiple ships before eventually attending Naval Postgraduate School and Columbia University, earning a Master of Science degree in electrical engineering. So when Hyman learned of the potential of nuclear energy, he became convinced that nuclear-powered ships, especially submarines, were the future of the Navy. Although most in the Navy were highly skeptical and critical of Hyman's idea, senior naval leaders like Chester Nimitz and Secretary of the Navy John Sullivan saw the vision. So Rickover was eventually allowed to oversee the development and construction of the world's first nuclear submarine, the USS Nautilus. But his influence did not stop there. For the following decades, Admiral Rickover directed the building and operating of the nuclear navy. Hyman even went a step further by personally interviewing every single nuclear engineering officer for the Navy, which numbered over 10,000. Although many saw Rickover as tyrannical and confrontational due to his high standards of training and discipline, his high standards resulted in an unparalleled record of nuclear safety in the US Navy. 82 years ago, on March 2nd, 1943, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea began. As part of General MacArthur's island-hopping strategy, the Allied forces sought to capture the Japanese-controlled bases in Papua New Guinea. In order to reinforce their base, the Japanese continued to send land, naval, and aerial reinforcements. However, Allied codebreakers and reconnaissance planes quickly learned of the Japanese plan. Their convoy with 8 destroyers, 8 troop transports, 100 fighter aircraft, and about 7,000 men was quickly spotted. Waves of American and Australian aircraft launched coordinated attacks from their base at Port Moresby. Their bombers with devastating accuracy struck and sunk multiple ships, while others caught fire. Although Japanese aircraft tried to protect their ships, the Allied relentless assaults continued to pound the convoy. By March 4th, the battle was over as the Japanese suffered a catastrophic defeat, losing all 8 transport ships, 4 destroyers, 20 aircraft, and about 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors, while the Allies suffered minimal casualties. 80 years ago, on May 7th, 1945, Germany unconditionally surrendered to the Allied forces. As British and American forces invaded Germany from the west, the Soviets encircled and captured their capital, Berlin, from the east. and with the Führer eliminated, command of the German forces fell to Grand Admiral Karl Donitz. But seeing that further resistance was pointless, he authorized his commanders to begin surrender negotiations. Hoping to save themselves from the brutality of the Soviets, German High Command desperately attempted to surrender only to the Western Allies. But all attempts were quickly shut down. So, with no other option, the Germans agreed to surrender to both sides. At first, unconditional surrender was signed by German General Alfred Jodl, American General Walter Bedell Smith, and Soviet General Ivan Sesloparov in Reims, France. But the Soviets demanded that the Germans sign the surrender documents in Berlin with a proper Soviet official. So Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov and German Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed in Berlin on May 9th. 204 years ago, on May 5th, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died. After his defeat at the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon once again was exiled, but this time to a much more remote place. The island of St. Helena, over 1,000 miles from any major landmass. And at just 46 years old, he had no prospects of ever leaving. Although the British provided Napoleon with a house, staff, and some comforts, his freedom was highly restricted. Governor Sir Hudson Lowe enforced strict security measures on Napoleon, limiting his access to the outside world, with 3,000 men and 4 vessels constantly guarding him. Eventually, his health gradually deteriorated, suffering most likely from stomach cancer, which eventually took him on May 5th, 1821, at just 51 years old. Did you know it took almost 20 years for Napoleon to be properly put to rest in France? You see, after his defeat at the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, located in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. There, far from his homeland, he would unfortunately pass at just 51 years old. However, Napoleon had expressed in his will that he wished to be buried on the banks of the Seine, in the midst of the French people whom I loved so much. A just request for a man who gave so much to his country. Unfortunately, fearing that his memory might still inspire rebellion, the monarchy refused. However, when Louis Philippe became king, he was hoping to gain support and strengthen his own regime. So, he eventually authorized what became known as the Retour de Sanda, the return of Napoleon's remains. So, in 1840, Napoleon's remains were transferred from St. Helena to Paris, eventually being placed in a tomb in the Les Invalides on April 2nd, 1861. Finally putting to rest France's greatest ever hero. 504 years ago, on April 27th, 1521, Ferdinand Magellan was killed in the Philippines. Magellan had already survived mutinies, starvation, and crossing the Pacific. Of the 270 men he started with, fewer than 150 remained, but they were close to completing the first circumnavigation of the globe. When they reached the Philippines, Magellan made alliances with multiple tribes and even converted them to Christianity. So when Magellan's new native Christian allies needed assistance from another local chieftain, Lapu-Lapu of the island of Mactan, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed 60 men and set off to crush him, confident in his superior weaponry and armor. Unfortunately, as they waded through water to reach the island of Mactan, they were met with a hail of spears, arrows, and stones. Magellan's heavy armor only slowed him down in the sand and sea, while his musketeers and crossbowmen couldn't hit the natives from the range they were at. So Magellan, surrounded and outnumbered, eventually fell to the native forces, leaving the expedition to Juan Sebastian Elcano. 189 years ago, on April 21st, 1836, the Battle of San Jacinto was fought. In April 1836, things looked really bad for the Texians, who, having just declared independence, were on the run from the Mexican army. But the fall of the Alamo and the massacre at Goliad only fueled Sam Houston's Texian troops with a desire for revenge. Fortunately, they learned that Santa Anna was with a small force and not far away. Houston saw this as the perfect opportunity to take him out, stating, "The army will cross and we will meet the enemy. Some of us may be killed and must be killed, but soldiers, remember the Alamo." Both armies camped just 500 yards away, but Santa Anna, believing the Texians to be demoralized and weak, made his camp in a vulnerable position. Even worse, he allowed his men to rest during the day. So that afternoon, Houston rushed his 900 troops in a surprise assault, storming the Mexican camp and shouting, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad." In just 18 swift minutes, almost all 1,300 Mexican soldiers were either captured or killed, including Santa Anna himself. 160 years ago, on April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered his 28,000-man army of Northern Virginia to General Ulysses S. Grant. effectively ending the American Civil War. After 4 years of war, Grant had finally managed to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond and trap Lee's starving, outnumbered, and exhausted army at Appomattox Courthouse. So Lee, with no other option, asked to meet in order to discuss surrender. The two men and multiple aides met in the Wilmer McLean home, Lee in his finest dress attire and Grant in his muddy field uniform, but both were extremely respectful to each other, ready to end the brutal conflict and begin reconstruction of the country. Grant offered generous terms. The Confederates would be paroled and allowed to go home with their property, while also being provided with Union rations. Additionally, Grant ordered his men not to celebrate or taunt, stating, "The Confederates were now our countrymen, and we did not want to exult over their downfall." 108 years ago, on April 17th, 1917, the Second Battle of Gaza began. After their failure in the First Battle of Gaza, the British Egyptian Expeditionary Force sought once again to break through Ottoman defensive lines and capture Gaza, which was a strategic gateway into Ottoman Palestine. With 25,000 troops supported by tanks, aircraft, and heavy artillery, British General Sir Archibald Murray believed that they could easily overpower the Ottoman positions. However, German General Friedrich von Kressenstein organized and strengthened the Ottoman defenses along the road from Gaza to the nearby town of Beersheba. After an artillery bombardment, the British, who outnumbered their enemies about 2 to 1, sent a frontal assault supported by 8 tanks and gas attacks. However, as the battle unfolded, British troops encountered stiff resistance from well-prepared Ottoman forces on high ground. Their tanks began to break down in the harsh desert terrain, and the poison gas had minimal effect. So, after 3 days of casualties, Murray was forced to call off the British attacks. 64 years ago, on April 17th, 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion began. In 1959, Fidel Castro had just established a communist regime in Cuba, but this spread of communism just 90 miles off the coast of Florida greatly alarmed the US. So relations between the two countries quickly deteriorated. So in order to overthrow Castro and implement a pro-US, non-communist regime in Cuba, the CIA began to devise a plan. Around 1,400 Cuban exiles were trained in order to reinvade their homeland, but the plan heavily counted on the Cuban people and military to support the invasion, while it also counted on Castro's military response to be weak. When John F. Kennedy became president, he authorized the invasion plan, but he wanted US support to be disguised. So when the exiles landed in the Bay of Pigs, they had little support from the US Air Force. Even worse, they were not supported by local Cubans. So the exiles were quickly overwhelmed by Castro's rapidly mobilized troops and aircraft, who defeated and captured most of the assault force. 164 years ago, on April 12, 1861, Fort Sumter was fired upon by Confederate forces, marking the beginning of the American Civil War. For decades, the North and South had been in a political battle over the issue of states' rights, especially regarding slavery, and by 1860, the anti-slavery Republican Party candidate of Abraham Lincoln was elected as president, causing many states to secede from the Union. Confederate militia forces began seizing United States forts and property throughout the South, and as one of the most important harbors in the South, the Union forts that defended Charleston Harbor were a major target for Confederate forces. So, Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard, with about 3,000 troops, besieged Fort Sumter. But after Major Robert Anderson refused to surrender, Confederates opened fire at 4:30 a.m., and for the next 34 hours, over 3,000 shots were fired on the fort. Outmanned, outgunned, and undersupplied, Major Anderson surrendered the 80-man garrison, leading President Lincoln to call for 75,000 Union volunteers to destroy the rebels. 107 years ago, on April 21st, 1918, the German flying ace Red Baron was shot down. As the top fighter ace in World War I, Manfred von Richthofen, dubbed the Red Baron for his iconic red plane, became feared and respected by enemies and allies, with 80 confirmed kills. However, while leading his squadron, known as the Flying Circus, through the Somme Valley, disaster struck. During the battle with the Royal Air Force, he pursued Canadian pilot Wilfrid May. However, he not only flew deep into enemy territory doing so, but he was also unusually low to the ground. This aggressive maneuver put him in a highly vulnerable position, so another Canadian pilot, Captain Arthur Roy Brown, took advantage, diving in and firing on the Red Baron's plane. Even worse, the Red Baron faced a barrage of concentrated machine gun fire from Australian troops on the ground, which struck him in the torso and caused him to crash into a nearby field on the Somme River. Although Captain Brown was credited, it was most likely the ground troops that finally ended the Red Baron. How did a Scottish outlaw become America's first naval legend? At just 13, John Paul Jones joined multiple British merchant ships, gaining valuable experience and knowledge of the seas, while making it to the rank of captain. Shortly after he emigrated to the colonies, the Revolutionary War began, so he quickly joined the Continental Navy. And as captain of the Providence, Jones sailed around the West Indies, sinking 8 ships and capturing another 8. His successes earned Jones the captaincy of the new ship Ranger, where he boldly raided the British coast. However, when France joined the war, he took command of the powerful 42-gun frigate Bonhomme Richard. With this ship, Jones engaged in a brutal battle with the 44-gun Royal Navy frigate Serapis. And although his vessel was burning and sinking during the battle, Jones refused to surrender, famously replying, "I have not yet begun to fight." Against all odds, he managed to capture the Serapis, a victory that stunned the British and inspired the American public. His aggressive tactics and naval expertise struck fear and confusion in the enemy. Did you know the first battle between iron warships was during the American Civil War? The Industrial Revolution led to the creation of steam-powered steel-plated warships, and while France and Britain developed the first ones, it was during the American Battle of Hampton Roads on March 9, 1862 that these ironclads first clashed in combat. The Confederate CSS Virginia was a wooden ship that was armored with sloped iron armor, with a total of 10 stationary guns and a 1,500-pound iron ram. This new powerful ship wreaked havoc on the Union blockade, sinking the Union wooden ships easily while inflicting over 350 casualties. Though the Union quickly responded with their own ironclad, the USS Monitor, which was much smaller but also much more maneuverable, armed with 2 guns on a rotating turret. For the next few hours, the ships pounded each other with cannons at close range, but the armor technology had actually surpassed the artillery technology, so neither ship suffered much damage. Eventually, the Monitor withdrew to shallow waters where the Virginia couldn't follow, leaving the battle a draw. 44 years ago, on March 30th, 1981, President Ronald Reagan was shot. After giving a speech, President Reagan walked out of the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C., waving to the crowd when suddenly 6 shots were fired from a .22 caliber revolver. The assassin, John Hinckley Jr., was able to hit Press Secretary James Brady, Secret Service Agent Timothy McCarthy, policeman Thomas Delahanty, and of course Ronald Reagan, as one of the bullets ricocheted off his limo and struck him under the left armpit, hitting his left lung. At first, he didn't realize he was shot. It's only when he coughed up blood that the truth set in. He was quickly rushed to George Washington University Hospital with a collapsed lung, but fortunately all 4 men would survive, including Reagan after a 2-hour surgery, though they would all continue to feel the effects of the gunshot for years. John Hinckley was arrested immediately, but in 1982 he was found not guilty due to insanity, as his lawyers claimed that he had a narcissistic personality disorder due to an obsession with the film Taxi Driver. Did you know the bloodiest day in French history occurred during the Battle of the Frontiers? As World War I erupted, both France and Germany mobilized their armies, each executing their battle plans. The French launched Plan 17, expecting the German resistance in Alsace and Lorraine to be much weaker, as they assumed that more German forces would be stationed on the Russian border. But Germany, with their Schlieffen Plan, would focus on France first, deploying the bulk of their troops in the west. So when the French advanced, they were met with far more resistance than expected, resulting in a series of immensely bloody engagements during the month-long Battle of the Frontiers, which resulted in over 300,000 total French casualties. The bloodiest day came on August 22, 1914, at the Battle of Ardennes, when 27,000 French soldiers were killed in a single day, as the French, still relying on outdated mass infantry charges, advanced blindly through thick fog and rain. The Germans, in dug-in positions, unleashed waves of artillery and machine gun fire, which tore the French to shreds. 189 years ago, on March 6, 1836, the Battle of the Alamo ended. Although Texan forces had captured the Alamo early on in their revolution, the Mexicans under General Santa Anna were on the march to recapture the fort and destroy their rebellion. However, defending the fort was Colonel James Bowie and Colonel William B. Travis, who were determined to defend the fort to the last man, as they considered the fort essential for securing supply lines, maintaining communications, and safeguarding nearby settlements. So the men quickly began fortifying by constructing entrenchments and erecting artillery platforms. On February 23rd, the Mexicans besieged Alamo with around 1,500 men, and for the next 2 weeks, the armies traded artillery and gunfire. Finally, on the 13th day of the siege, Santa Anna threw 1,800 men into a final assault. Hundreds of Mexicans were decimated by the artillery and gunfire of the defenders, but the sheer numbers eventually overwhelmed the Texans. So after about 90 minutes of intense fighting, all but a few of the 200 defenders lay dead, though their courageous defense only intensified the revolution. Did Europeans intentionally give Native Americans diseases? While the spread of Old World diseases devastated indigenous populations in America, the vast majority of these infections were unintentional. There are actually very few documented instances where Europeans deliberately used disease as a weapon. One of the few documentations of this practice was in 1763 at the siege of Fort Pitt, when Sir Geoffrey Amherst wrote to Colonel Bouquet stating, "Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox among these disaffected tribes of Indians? We must, on this occasion, use every stratagem in our power to reduce them." Bouquet responded, "I will try to inoculate with some blankets that may fall in their hands, and take care not to get the disease myself." Though it is unclear whether Bouquet actually carried out his plan, Captain William Trent did write down that, "We gave them 2 blankets and a handkerchief out of the smallpox hospital. I hope it'll have the desired effect." Though it is difficult to say if the schemes actually worked. What's the difference between strategy and tactics? You might think these words are interchangeable, but they mean very different things. Strategy refers to an overarching approach to achieving a long-term goal, such as winning a war or controlling a territory. It involves many factors, such as a nation's logistics, politics, and resources. Tactics, on the other hand, are the specific actions taken to achieve short-term objectives, like flanking an enemy on the battlefield or setting up an ambush. As Sun Tzu wisely put it, strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy are the noise before defeat. A good example of a strategist general versus a tactician general is Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. General Grant understood that the Union had a vast advantage in resources and manpower, so he was often aggressive during his campaigns. General Lee, on the other hand, tactically won many battles early on, such as Second Manassas, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville, but these victories never amounted to any significant strategic objective. How 300 Spartans held off 300,000 Persians. After Persian king Darius failed to conquer Greece, his son Xerxes launched a second invasion in 480 BC. Learning of this, a coalition of Greek city-states formed, sending Spartan king Leonidas with about 7,000 Greek soldiers to defend the narrow pass of Thermopylae, the gateway to central Greece. Thermopylae's steep mountains and narrow coastal path not only reduced the effectiveness of the Persian superior numbers and cavalry, but it was also perfect for the Greek phalanx. Xerxes sent force after force for 3 days, but they were all repelled, including his elite immortals. Shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, the disciplined and skillful Spartans cut down all in their path. However, the tide turned when a Greek traitor, Ephialtes, revealed a secret path to the Persians, allowing them to flank the Greeks. Realizing they were surrounded, Leonidas ordered most of the Greek forces to retreat, choosing to stay behind with his 300 Spartans and a few hundred allies. Although they would all perish, their final stand bought time for Greece to prepare its defenses. Did you know the bloodiest day in French history occurred during the Battle of the Frontiers? As World War I erupted, both France and Germany mobilized their armies, each executing their battle plans. The French launched Plan 17, expecting the German resistance in Alsace and Lorraine to be much weaker, as they assumed that more German forces would be stationed on the Russian border. But Germany, with their Schlieffen Plan, would focus on France first, deploying the bulk of their troops in the west. So when the French advanced, they were met with far more resistance than expected, resulting in a series of immensely bloody engagements during the month-long Battle of the Frontiers, which resulted in over 300,000 total French casualties. The bloodiest day came on August 22, 1914, at the Battle of Ardennes, when 27,000 French soldiers were killed in a single day, as the French, still relying on outdated mass infantry charges, advanced blindly through thick fog and rain. The Germans, in dug-in positions, unleashed waves of artillery and machine gun fire, which tore the French to shreds, forcing them into a chaotic retreat. How 700 knights held off 40,000 Ottomans. You see, the island of Malta was an incredibly strategic Christian stronghold in the middle of the Mediterranean, so the Ottomans sought to capture it in order to conquer more of Europe. However, defending the island were the Knights of St. John, who not only strengthened their 3 forts of St. Elmo, St. Michael, and St. Angelo, but they also called upon local militia and various soldiers from Spain and Italy to increase increased their ranks to 6,000, though they were still massively outnumbered by the Ottoman invasion force of around 30 to 40,000 troops. Using a huge siege tower, the Turkish forces assaulted Fort St. Elmo, relentlessly bombarding and attacking it with overwhelming numbers, causing it to eventually fall. However, they bought time for the remaining defenders, who used a delay to strengthen their fortifications. So when the Ottomans attacked Fort St. Angelo and Fort St. Michael, they faced fierce resistance from even more heavily fortified positions. Additionally, counterattacks and nighttime raids caused significant casualties while disrupting Ottoman siege operations. After holding out for 4 months, the defenders were eventually relieved when new Italian and Spanish troops launched a devastating counteroffensive that forced the Ottomans to retreat with around 25,000 casualties. 212 years ago, on February 26, 1813, Robert Livingston died. As part of the influential Livingston and Beekman New York family, Robert played a key role during the American Revolution and the formation of the new government as a lawyer, statesman, and founding father, even being a member of the Declaration of Independence Draft Committee. After swearing in George Washington as president, Robert, under President Thomas Jefferson, helped negotiate the Louisiana Purchase as the U.S. minister to France, though he is best known for being the Chancellor of New York for almost 24 years. 255 years ago, on March 5th, 1770, the Boston Massacre occurred. On a cold and snowy evening, Private Hugh White was guarding the Boston Custom House when a young apprentice passed by and started insulting Officer John Goldfinch and Private White. Things quickly escalated when the apprentice Garrick poked Goldfinch, leading White to strike him with his musket. Over 50 Bostonians rapidly flooded around White, fueled by their hatred of the British occupation of their city. White, overwhelmed and being hit with rocks and ice, called for reinforcements. Captain Thomas Preston dispatched 7 soldiers and ordered the crowd to disperse, but by then it had grown to 300 to 400. Suddenly, within the chaos, someone struck Private Montgomery, knocking him down and causing him to drop his musket. When he recovered, he fired his weapon and angrily shouted, "Damn you, fire." Unfortunately, the other soldiers fired their weapons as well, which hit 11 people, killing Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, Samuel Maverick, Patrick Carr, and Crispus Attucks. 6 of the soldiers were acquitted, while the other 2 were branded. 80 years ago, on March 26, 1945, the Battle of Iwo Jima ended. You see, the tiny island of Iwo Jima was critical for the US, as it would allow them to easily strike mainland Japan. So, after the US unleashed their naval bombardment on the island, 80,000 Marines began to land. They believed that their bombardments had wiped out the Japanese defenses, but General Kiribayashi had other plans. He knew he couldn't hold the island, so he simply tried to inflict as many casualties as possible, turning Iwo Jima into a slaughterhouse, with over 13,000 yards of hidden tunnels, machine gun nests, and artillery. So although the Marines were able to land on the beach without much resistance, as soon as they went inland, the Japanese unleashed hell. Every single step forward cost American lives. Although nearly all 20,000 Japanese soldiers would die, over 7,000 Marines were killed, and another 20,000 were wounded in just 5 weeks, making it one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. Did you know the Battle of Gorita Pass is considered the Gettysburg of the West? The Battle of Gettysburg is often known as the turning point of the entire Civil War, but the Battle of Gorita Pass changed everything in the Far West theater. You see, in March 1862, Confederate forces marched deep into New Mexico. Their goal? Control the West. If they could take the gold and silver mines, railroads, and ports, they could fund their army and cut off the Union. And they had already beaten the Union at the Battle of Val Verde. All they needed was to capture Fort Union. So to capture it, Confederate Colonel Scurry moved his 1,300 men through Gorita Pass. At first, it looked like another win. They flanked Union forces, forcing them into retreat. But they made one fatal mistake. They left their supply wagons unguarded. So when Union Major Shivington took his men on a stealth mission to sneak behind, he was easily able to set fire to everything. 90 wagons and 800 animals all gone. So with their army starving and stranded, the Confederates had no choice but to abandon the campaign. When was poison gas first used in World War I? Well, the French actually tried tear gas first, but it was only used on a small scale. Then came the Germans, with their first serious attempt against the Russians at the Battle of Bolimov. They launched a tear gas attack hoping to break their lines, but it was mostly ineffective as the cold froze the gas. But the Germans learned chemical weapons had potential. So on April 22, 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, they tried again, this time with something far deadlier. chlorine gas. After the usual artillery barrage, French troops braced for an infantry assault, but instead a greenish-yellow cloud rolled across no man's land. 167 tons of chlorine gas drifted into the Allied trenches. The French colonial troops began coughing, choking, and panicking as their lungs began to burn. Many fled, causing a 4-mile wide gap to open up in the Allied line. But the Germans weren't even ready. Shocked by their own success, they hesitated and missed their chance to push forward. 179 years ago, on May 13th, 1846, the US declared war on Mexico. In the 1840s, tensions between the US and Mexico were at a breaking point. Texas had just become a US state, but Mexico didn't even recognize Texas as independent. So the borders between the two countries were highly disputed, especially in the region between the Nueces and Rio Grande rivers. So when a new pro-expansionist president was elected, things were bound to escalate. To assert authority in the territory he saw as the US's, President James K. Polk sent General Zachary Taylor to the disputed region. Mexico, seeing it as an invasion into their own territory, responded, sending cavalry that attacked the US patrol on April 25th. Leaving President Polk to call for war, famously stating that Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon the American soil. Congress agreed with Polk and officially declared war, leading to a nearly 2-year-long conflict that eventually saw over 520,000 square miles of land ceded to the US. 572 years ago, on May 29th, 1453, Constantinople fell to Ottoman forces. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had stood as a fortress of Christianity as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. But when the ambitious Mehmed II became Sultan of the rising Ottoman Empire, he made plans to conquer the city. Even though his supplies and reinforcements were cut off by the Ottoman blockade, Emperor Constantine still had some fight left in him, so he began to reinforce the walls, forge new weapons, and dig ditches. Still, Constantine had only around 7,000 defenders, while Mehmed had an army of over 80,000. Despite the imbalance, they were prepared to fight to the last man. The siege began on April 6. For weeks, the Ottomans bombarded the centuries-old Theodosian walls, but the defenders held. When reinforcements arrived for Constantine, Mehmed pulled a shocking move. He dragged his ships over land to strike from behind. Still, the defenders refused to surrender, so Mehmed launched a final, all-out assault from land and sea. After 53 brutal days, the walls crumbled and the city fell. 80 years ago, on June 22nd, 1945, the Battle of Okinawa ended. After months of island hopping, the US had finally reached the last major stepping stone before Japan's mainland, the strategic island of Okinawa. If the US could secure the island, it would allow them to strike Japan with their bombers, place their fleets to blockade the mainland, and eventually launch a complete ground invasion of Japan. So, on April 1st, the US landed 60,000 soldiers, who initially faced little resistance. But just days later, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers hidden in their dense forests and fortified caves launched their vicious campaign. For 82 brutal days, carnage engulfed the land, sea, and sky. And, as always, the Japanese never surrendered. So eventually, nearly all 100,000 troops would perish during the battle. And, unfortunately, many civilians also suffered as they got caught in the crossfire, causing an additional 100,000 deaths. Although US forces secured the island after 82 days and 50,000 casualties, the battle showed just how devastating an invasion of Japan would be. Has there ever been a 6-star general in the US Army? Well, during World War II, American generals had a problem. They were constantly outranked by their European allies. To combat this problem, Congress established a new rank titled General of the Army. This new rank was an unprecedented 5 stars and was given to just 5 men. But what is the 6-star rank? Well, in 1919, World War I General John J. Pershing was promoted to the rank General of the Armies. But how do we know this rank is higher than the World War II rank? Well, Congress stated in Public Law 78482 that nothing in this act shall affect the provisions of the Act of September 3rd, 1919. So although this rank is technically higher than the World War II 5-star rank, the 6-star insignia is not official. In fact, Pershing oddly wore 4 gold stars. To make it even more confusing, 2 other men have this 6-star rank, both of whom are dead. George Washington was posthumously promoted in 1976 to make sure he always holds the most senior position, and just recently, General Ulysses S. Grant was posthumously promoted in 2024. Has there ever been a 6-star admiral in the US Navy? Well, in 1898, during the Spanish-American War, the US sent Commodore George Dewey to destroy the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay. After completely annihilating the Spanish without losing a single ship, Dewey instantly became a national hero. So in 1899, Congress created a new special rank just for him, Admiral of the Navy. 40 years later, during World War II, Congress needed a higher rank than Admiral, so they created the 5-star rank Fleet Admiral. Since the Navy basically retired Dewey's rank Admiral of the Navy when he died in 1917, some believe Dewey's rank was more of an honorary 4-star rank with a special title. In fact, the Navy clarified that Fleet Admiral of the United States Navy shall be considered the senior-most rank. However, Dewey's Admiral of the Navy rank had actually been given a 19-gun salute. Ultimately, was Dewey a 6-star admiral? Officially no, since Dewey only ever wore 4 stars. But, depending on how you look at it, Dewey is either a lower rank, the same rank, or a higher rank than Fleet Admiral. Only 9 men in American history have held a rank higher than 4 stars. But who were these 5-star officers? Well, during World War II, American officers had a problem. They were constantly outranked by their European allies. So Congress authorized the establishment of a 5-star rank. 9 men in total achieved this rank, 5 generals and 4 admirals. In December 1944, 4 generals were promoted to the 5-star rank General of the Army. These men include U.S. Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall, Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific Area Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Allied Commander of Europe Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Henry Hap Arnold, Commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Additionally, 3 admirals were promoted to the 5-star rank Fleet Admiral in the same month: William D. Leahy, Ernest King, and Chester Nimitz. However, there were 2 other men promoted to a 5-star rank, both after World War II. General Omar Bradley was promoted to 5 stars in September 1950, and Admiral William Halsey Jr. was promoted to Fleet Admiral in December of 1945. Only one man in American history has ever held a 5-star rank in 2 military branches. You see, during World War II, Henry Hap Arnold was promoted to the 5-star rank General of the Army, being put in charge of the Army Air Forces. But after the war, when the US Air Force actually became an independent branch, General Arnold was also given the 5-star rank General of the Air Force in 1949. 1346. 15,000 English soldiers just invaded France, brutally pillaging and burning the countryside in Normandy. So, to finally stop the carnage, French King Philippe VI assembled a massive 30,000-strong army. English King Edward III knew he'd be outnumbered, so he decided to tactically organize his troops on a hill, placing his longbowmen on the flanks and his infantry in the center. Philippe met the English at Crécy and sent in his crossbowmen to begin the assault. However, for some reason, the crossbowmen had no shields, and even worse, the rain had rendered their crossbows useless. So the English longbowmen completely decimated the incoming crossbowmen, forcing them to retreat. Seeing them retreat, the mounted French knights drew their swords and began charging straight into the English formation. This had no better of an outcome. The muddy uphill terrain and retreating crossbowmen made the cavalry extremely slow and vulnerable. They too were cut down by a ferocious horde of arrows. Still, the rest of the French persisted with charge after charge. The few that did reach the English line fought in fierce hand-to-hand combat. But ultimately, after 15 failed charges, the French suffered thousands of casualties, forcing them to retreat. What actually happened at the first Thanksgiving? Well, in 1620, 102 English settlers boarded the Mayflower and crossed the Atlantic in search of religious freedoms and economic opportunities. But when they reached Massachusetts, winter nearly wiped them out. Disease, starvation, and freezing conditions killed almost half the Pilgrims. Fortunately for the settlers, they found some natives who actually spoke English, so they were able to make peace with the friendly Wampanoag tribe. These native translators, especially Squanto, taught the settlers how to fish, grow corn, tap trees, and avoid deadly plants. By autumn 1621, the settlers had a bountiful harvest, so to thank God for finally surviving in the New World, the Pilgrims held a feast. Their allies, the Wampanoag, led by Chief Massasoit, joined them, bringing deer, food, and 90 men. Although the natives and Pilgrims did not actually call it Thanksgiving, over the following decades, many colonies held their own religious days of thanks, and Abraham Lincoln finally declared Thanksgiving a national holiday in 1863. How exactly did Squanto speak English to the Pilgrims? Many remember the friendly Native American Squanto for helping the Pilgrims survive in the New World. But how he knew English is actually a very dark story. You see, the Mayflower Pilgrims were actually not the first Europeans to reach Massachusetts. Years earlier, European explorers had landed near the Patuxet tribe, killing and enslaving many of the tribesmen, and among the captured was Squanto. He was taken across the Atlantic and sold in Spain. But he eventually made his way to England, where he lived with merchants who taught him English. After years away, Squanto finally sailed back to North America, and with the help of English captain Thomas Dermer, he was able to return to his home village. But what Squanto found devastated him. His home tribe was decimated due to the diseases the Europeans had brought over. With no home left, Squanto became an interpreter for Chief Massasoit of the Wampanoag. And that's why, when pilgrims came ashore, a Native American was able to speak to them in English. The history of Hanukkah explained in 60 seconds. Although the Seleucid Empire was fairly tolerant of the Jews in Judea, things quickly changed when King Antiochus IV sent his soldiers to Jerusalem, where they attempted to force the Jews to become more Greek. Eventually, Antiochus intensified the persecution by banning their animal sacrifices, their observance of the Sabbath, their festivals, circumcision, and even their scriptures. The ultimate insult, however, came when the Seleucid authorities put up statues of their pagan gods and slaughtered pigs in the temple. For the Jews, two options were clear: convert or die. Although some Jews converted, many did not. So, a Jewish resistance was soon formed, led by Judah, who took over the Jewish army and became known as Judas Maccabeus, or Hammer of Judea, in 167 BC. Although they were outnumbered, Judah and his fighters waged a 3-year-long campaign, using guerrilla-style tactics against both the Seleucid troops and Hellenized Jews, eventually retaking Jerusalem and cleansing the Holy Temple. And according to legend, even though they only had enough oil for one night, the menorah miraculously stayed lit for 8 nights. Ever since, Jews have celebrated the victory in an annual 8-day celebration on its anniversary, known as the Festival of Dedication, or Hanukkah. How did Moshe Dayan get his famous eye patch? Well, during World War II, Dayan was fighting for the British in the Middle East, mostly doing reconnaissance, which placed him in very exposed positions close to enemy lines. In 1941, British forces were preparing an invasion into Syria and Lebanon against the Axis-aligned French forces there. On the night before the invasion, Dayan was on the roof of a building using binoculars to scan French positions, when suddenly a single shot rang out from a sniper several hundred yards away. Moshe Dayan had been struck by a French rifle bullet through his binoculars. Metal and glass fragments immediately flew into his left eye, causing severe damage. When he was eventually evacuated 6 hours later, his eye was unfortunately lost. In fact, the damage was so extreme that Dayan could not even be fitted with a glass eye, so he was forced to adopt his famous black eye patch, which eventually became his trademark. Though early on, he actually hated the eye patch, stating, "I was ready to make any effort and stand any suffering if only I could get rid of my black eye patch." Which American Civil War battle had the most forces engaged? While you might think of the Battle of Gettysburg because it had the most casualties, Gettysburg only had around 165,000 total forces engaged. The battle with the most forces engaged is actually the Battle of Fredericksburg. You see, in 1862, General McClellan failed to pursue Lee after the Battle of Antietam, so President Lincoln removed McClellan. The new commander, General Burnside, was under intense pressure to strike quickly, so he rushed his army toward Fredericksburg, hoping to cross the Rappahannock River and position himself between Lee and the Confederate capital of Richmond. Unfortunately for Burnside, the pontoon bridges he needed to cross were delayed, allowing enough time for the Confederates to dig into defensive positions. When Burnside was eventually able to cross, the Confederates devastated the incoming Union, with most of the fighting happening on December 13th, at the strong defensive Confederate position at Marye's Heights. Although the Battle of Fredericksburg only had around 18,000 casualties, by the end, roughly 200,000 soldiers had been engaged, 120,000 Union and 78,000 Confederate. Who actually traded the most African slaves? While some might think Jews primarily ran the slave trade, that is actually not true. Although some Jewish merchants participated in it, they were a very small portion of the trade, not the main driving force behind it. By most historical estimates, it was actually the Muslim states that traded the most African slaves, even more than the European Christian states. You see, the European-dominated transatlantic slave trade took place from about the 1500s to the 1800s, transporting 8 to 12 million enslaved Africans. But for about 1300 years, from the 600s to the 1900s, The Islamic states in the Middle East enslaved an estimated 15 to 18 million men, women, and children through the Trans-Saharan, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean routes, either capturing the slaves in raids or buying slaves from local African rulers. However, unlike the transatlantic slave trade, which mostly enslaved men for hard manual labor, the Muslim states sought out women for domestic labor and concubinage. And the men who were enslaved by the Muslim states were often castrated, resulting in a very high mortality rate. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, World War I came to an end. After over 4 years of brutal fighting, the Central Powers were in collapse. Immense civil unrest, food shortages, and military disasters led to the surrender of Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary. By November, only Germany stood, but they too had no choice but to seek peace, leading Kaiser Wilhelm II to abdicate and flee. The new German government, hoping to avoid total collapse, agreed to an armistice with the Allies. Unfortunately for them, peace came at a massive cost. The Allies demanded harsh punishments for Germany, including heavy reparations, large territorial losses, and massive military restrictions. Although the guns of World War I fell silent, disaster still plagued Europe. Roughly 16 to 20 million people had lost their lives. Most of Europe was in ruin, and hyperinflation, the Spanish flu, and food shortages caused even more political chaos and economic turmoil. The Great War was over, but the consequences would ultimately lead to another world war just 20 years later.